The hero was born on a day of fierce storms and roaring winds, ultimately receiving the legendary blessing of the wind spirit at birth. Ever since he was a kid, he could already summon this small power and left everyone around him completely amazed. Everyone said he had insane talent for magic and that one day he'd become the most important mage in the entire kingdom. All he wanted was to make his family proud and live a peaceful life, except reality hit him in the worst way possible. A terrible tragedy destroyed everything he loved most, and he found out that blessing came with a high price in blood. After carrying that unbearable burden for so long, the hero finally reached the only sensible answer. He would hunt down and eliminate those who had cursed his life. A few years later, in the village of Ratville, within the kingdom of Therys, several locals were searching desperately for something, but unfortunately, they weren't finding anything useful. A woman breaks down, crying that they can't find anything, and wasted another day searching. A man nearby grows increasingly worried, wondering where everything they seek could possibly have gone entirely beyond their reach. Out of nowhere, a traveler arrives and asks whether the village has an inn. The local apologizes and explains that something troubling happened, so welcoming travelers is difficult here at present. For now, the local suggests he continue toward the next town. After hearing that the traveler asks what happened, and mentions noticing that everyone seems to be searching for something, he adds that maybe he can help them out with their little problem. He strikes a dramatic pose with the wind blowing around him, and introduces himself as the Wind Mage. The villager looks confused after the Wind Mage introduction, instantly killing the mood. Still, the local thanks him for offering, though he doubts this stranger can truly help. The traveler feels a bit awkward, and asks if they even know what mages actually are. A woman says she heard back in her childhood that mages were dangerous, but he says she's completely mistaken. He then starts explaining what truly defines a mage. He explains that mages are people capable of controlling an unfathomable force known as magic. He says magic can move boulders the size of houses, shift mighty rivers, and accomplish greater things beyond imagination. He goes on to say that magic can even save those on the brink of passing away, doing things way beyond human limits. He adds that elemental magic is a special type that very few people can master. That's because it requires a contract with nature spirits, something only those with a deep understanding of the elements can pull off. He shows off, bragging that he's a mage who controls the wind spirit and that there's no place on earth the wind can't reach. The guy asks if they think he can help now, but the villager wonders why someone so important would do this for free. He pretends to be insulted by their doubt and asks if they've really never heard of him before. The young man explains that there are a few famous mages in the world, like Alex Magellan, the great mage who protected the nation. He also mentions Mahatma, known as the saint deeply cherished by the heavens. Another big name he drops is Karuna, who stands as the guardian of all mages. Finally, he introduces the Wind Mage as the one who solves the problems of those in deep trouble. He asks if no one knows the grey-haired mercenary with the blue bird who handles any request, and a villager finally remembers him. The guy cockily confirms that's him, giving the local a ray of hope. The young man then reveals that besides being a mage, he also works as a mercenary. He makes the money gesture with his fingers and warns that if they throw in a nice reward, he'll fix their problem. An elderly man from the village quickly accepts the offer and rushes to gather the necessary coins for the payment. The traveler tells him to slow down, warning that urgent cases include a rush fee. Meanwhile, the mysterious newcomer observes the entire exchange in silence. The scene moves inside the village inn, where the fraud hides all the money squeezed from the locals. He grins greedily at many gold coins spread across a nearby table beside him, while blabbering about how desperate those people were. The scammer gets ready to split, celebrating how well the scam worked on a bunch of country bumpkins. He runs through the forest laughing, saying it's their own fault for being naive enough to fall for such a dumb pit. But his escape gets cut short by someone. The hero blocks his path and asks why he is rushing away without completing the request. The scammer recognizes him as the traveler who had appeared in the very same village earlier. He orders the traveler to mind his own business and leave. He feels generous today and is willing to let the stranger walk away safely in one piece. The hero refuses and demands he return all the villagers' money if he has no intention of helping them. Annoyed, the mage drops his stuff and asks if the stranger thinks he's an easy target. He then decides to end the argument and casts a knife spell. Finally, he warns Raneon that challenging a mage without understanding his power is a foolish, dangerous mistake with serious consequences for everyone involved. His warning ends. He launches the attack with full force, shouting he'll be the last mage Raneon ever sees. However, Raneon blocks it all with ease, showing his vast magic. Right after, he confirms that he truly is a mage, but wonders why anyone with such power would resort to running such a cheap scam. The phony is left speechless, seeing his attack thrown back so easily. Then Raneon asks if he used pheromones to attract glowbugs just to fool poor villagers, and says he feels ashamed as a real mage to witness this cheap trick. Finally, Raneon warns the fraud that his lies and schemes end right here, and the scammer's counterfeit bluebird screeches hysterically inside its cage, desperately calling out for help, like a parrot. Meanwhile, Raneon begins concentrating powerful wind magic within his open palm, as he explains that the real wind spirit called Elkin isn't an ordinary imitation parrot. Holding the spirit between his hands, he explains that this creature represents the wind itself. That creature is the king of all wind spirits, known as Elkan. The scammer panics when he sees the true wind mage in front of him. Just as Elkan surprises the trickster by speaking, joking that his disguise actually looked pretty similar to his foolish master. The real wind mage demands he give back all the villagers' money to earn forgiveness for his fraud. The trickster remembers seeing that man fight on the battlefield once, which is why he doesn't need to chant spells. That day, dozens of soldiers were brought down by a single mage, who demonstrated enough power to challenge an entire army alone. He remembers that, despite all that destructive power, no one lost their life to the wind mage in battle. He thinks his opponent is too soft and won't hurt a soul out of pure kindness. The scammer reaches for a hidden knife. The fraud pretends to surrender with a fake laugh, saying he'll hand over the heavy bag of gold coins without complaining. He returns the money while preparing a surprise attack. Convinced soft-hearted warriors lower their guard far too easily. The wind mage accepts the coins and advises the young man to stop exploiting innocent people and earn an honest living. Suddenly, the scammer lunges with a dagger, yelling that he just needs to get close to win this fight once and for all. But the wind mage reacts instantly, summoning Ellie, a lesser wind spirit. Raneon then turns directly toward the scammer. He unleashes a spiraling wind spell that wraps completely around the trickster's arm. The air twists with such violence that it begins crushing and snapping the trickster's arm without a shred of mercy. In unbearable pain, the scammer lets out a desperate scream of pure agony. He drops to his knees, holding his broken arm. The wind mage warns it'll be a long time before he can use magic again. The mage grabs the scammer by the throat, telling him never to pull scams anywhere near him ever again under any circumstances. He warns that their next meeting will end with the scammer's neck snapping just like his arm. Terrified beyond reason, the trickster jumps to his feet and races away as fast as possible through the woods in tears. The mage watches the fraud vanish into the distance, while the spirit Elkan sarcastically comments on how fast the guy ran to save his skin. Elkan jokes that Raneon is far too kind for making threats without intending to finish him off, but the mage says the fraud won't be fooling anyone else anymore. The spirit suggests it would have been safer to just take him out for good, but the mage dismisses the idea while opening the fake bird's cage. He reveals that he helps people with his mercenary jobs to try to make up for the terrible things he plans to do in the future. For that reason, he doesn't want to stack up even more sins by taking the life of someone as insignificant as that scammer. He carries on his way, determined to keep his hands clean until he can find and eliminate his real target. The next day, in the little village of Ratville, right then, a heavy bag full of coins is suddenly slammed down onto a wooden table. Raneon calmly tells the couple that the wind mage they hired yesterday is a complete fraud. He explains that he caught the crook trying to sneak off in the middle of the night with all their money. He says he retrieved their deposit and warns them to be more careful in the future about who they hire. The man is utterly speechless, resting his chin in his hand, mumbling that everything makes sense now. He vents that the guy really did look sketchy, but they were just too desperate to second-guess it. Raneon quietly takes it all in, understanding the grief of those humble people. The mage thinks to himself that he can't afford to delay his own journey any longer. However, his steps are stopped when the woman runs up to him, asking him to wait. She explains that they are very poor and that everyone in the village would be crushed if they had lost that money. The woman holds his hand, thanking him for protecting them and apologizing for how they acted the day before. She hands him a small food package for the road, saying it's all they have to offer. Finally, the woman sincerely wishes the mage good luck on his journey and says goodbye. Raneon stands quietly in the woods for a moment, looking at the food package he just received. Back at the tavern, the locals say they don't have time to sit around and need to get back to searching. Stepping inside, the woman gets confused, seeing all the commotion, and asks what's going on. At that moment, Raneon steps back into the building to get a better read on the situation. He raises his arm with his majestic spirit, catching the attention of every villager in the room. With a dead, serious look, he asks if they could explain the issue to him as well. The man reveals that not long ago, one of the village kids vanished without a trace, but this time, things took a turn for the worse, and every child in the village went missing at once. He continues mournfully, stating that the first child who went missing earlier was sadly found without a pulse, and worst of all, the body was missing its heart. Raneon is shocked by the revelation, and the man confirms it didn't look like an attack from a wild animal. He explains that the wound appeared deliberately carved out using a sharp blade. A memory from the past shows frantic people running for their lives amidst a burning fire. Right after, a man is violently struck from behind with a deep, bloody slash. In the middle of the flames, a dark figure coldly demands that Simon do something useful for once. A terrified, sobbing boy is left behind in the middle of all that destruction. He watches in horror as the reflection of a knight with a raised sword gets ready to deliver the blow. Meanwhile, a terrifying voice harshly commands him to hand over his heart right now. Back in the present, the villager laments that nobody knows why this is happening and that the situation is driving everyone crazy. Raneon then suggests that maybe all of this is directly tied to the use of magic. The couple is completely taken aback by his guess and asks what makes him think that. The mage explains that to folks who don't know magic, it might sound like a weird old wives' tale. He talks about the ridiculous rumor that eating the heart of a young mage grants anyone magical powers. The man argues in confusion that their village has absolutely no connection to the magical world. Raneon explains that mana flow weakens as people grow, but children can have hidden magical talent. Then, he forms a small orb of wind in his hand and asks if they can see anything there. The mage holds out his glowing hand so everyone in the room can watch the test closely. The villager answers, confused, saying he can only see a faint blue glow and feel a soft breeze. Raneon pushes the test, asking if they truly don't see anything inside that bright light. Seeing the couple's continued silence and confusion, he asks what they thought they were supposed to see. He realizes regular people can't see spirits, wondering if just any heart with mana would do. Suddenly, the woman remembers an important detail and says something very similar happened recently. She shares that members of the Ernia Order went house to house, holding a strange lantern and asking questions. Raneon grabs her by the shoulders, visibly tense, and urgently asks if she remembers their faces. Seeing the woman's hesitation and shock, the mage quickly begins searching under his robes. He pulls out a realistic wanted poster and asks her straight up if the man she saw was that person. After that, Raneon walks deep in thought, down a path lined with massive trees in the forest. He moves in total silence, trying to piece together all the clues he picked up back at the village. The woman had disclosed that the locals couldn't actually see the visitors' faces. That was because they all wore bizarre masks and claimed to be monks from the Ernia Order. She described their lantern's light as an eerie yellow, identical to the one he created earlier during testing. Raneon identifies it as a light spirit and wonders why the Ernia Order would perform that test. Elkan asks whether his target would truly do this, or whether he is simply wasting time helping the villagers in need. The mage reveals that the mysterious man named Klein used to hunt young mages' hearts back in the day too. On top of that, he got word that Klein was spotted around this region fairly recently. That matches up perfectly with the horrific incident of the child found without a pulse or a heart. He feels it's too much of a coincidence, but Elkan points out there'd be no reason for the other kids to vanish. After all, none of those simple villagers have even a spark of talent for using magic. Even so, Raneon pushes himself up the cliff, stating he can't just turn a blind eye to it. With steady steps, he finally reaches the top of the cliff to start searching the woods thoroughly. The mage is certain they'll spot a solid lead if they investigate from up high. Elkan asks why they climbed up there, and Raneon explains the kidnappers couldn't have gone far with the kids. He concludes the criminals definitely set up a hideout somewhere close by. He figures the village couldn't find them because a mage is helping them hide using barrier magic. But the mage recalls that, just as the fraud said, there's no place the wind can't reach. He then summons the lesser spirit, Ellie, who instantly multiplies into several wind birds. Right after, Raneon focuses as the tiny creatures race through the open sky at truly tremendous speeds. Clasping his hands in deep focus, he casts the tracking spell known as Wind's Eye. The small wind spirits fly swiftly across the forest, scouting every hidden corner of the woods while transmitting their vision back to Raneon. He sees everything they see with crystal clarity. A mental map of the forest gradually forms within his mind through this advanced spirit search. He stays locked in and focused from his high vantage point, sifting through the data sent by the birds. Suddenly, one of his tiny wind birds picks up on something unusual and follows a strange trail in the woods. The lesser spirit spots a massive magic distortion in the brush and begins circling the suspicious area. The mage opens his eyes in surprise and smirks, muttering that he finally found the exact hidden spot. He moves closer and realizes they managed to conceal the whole structure using a powerful magic barrier. Elkan gets excited and urges him to hurry up and undo the enemy's camouflage magic. The mage calmly admits he doesn't know how to do that, leaving the spirit deeply annoyed and lost on the plan. Raneon explains they just need to draw them out, since you can't completely mask your physical presence. He then extends his arm and summons the mighty El Shooter, a high-level wind spirit. Elkan seriously questions that choice, warning that the spell won't ever scratch the magic barrier. The mage brushes off the warning and points his arm up, directing the massive blast of wind straight into the sky. El Shooter's wind gathers up high and drops like an overwhelming spear straight onto the barrier's center. With an intensely focused look, He shouts the name of his powerful move, Cyclone Spear. The violent whirlwind slams into the hidden stone structure with devastating force. The impact unleashes a deafening crash through the surrounding forest, frightening birds that quickly fly away in panic. Completely shocked by the destruction scale, Elkan angrily screams that Raneon is a total lunatic. Raneon carefully checks out the results and thinks all this massive damage means they will be forced to come out. The earth keeps shaking wildly as dust and rubble slowly settle across the ruined site. The mage remains standing firm and completely unbothered by the heavy wind he just unleashed in the clearing. However, he and the spirit start coughing up a storm due to all the dust kicked up from the ground. Several stones and debris from the destroyed structure keep slowly crumbling around them. A thick cloud of smoke and dust wraps around the old tower, which has now been fully exposed. Elkan complains that he should have struck the perimeter, but Raneon calmly explains his reasoning. The mage believed the 15 children were being hidden in a much larger underground chamber far below. Because of that, the heavy wind impact was necessary, shutting his complaining spirit up for good. Either way, he smiles and says it looks like they pulled off the main goal of the mission. The mage tells his spirit not to get so worked up while they study the old tower ahead. He quickly slips behind a thick tree to watch the entrance closely from a safely concealed position. Just then, the massive wooden door of the tower slowly creaks open with a loud groan. A monk dressed in dark robes and a hood steps outside to check what caused that explosion. He wears that same freaky mask, shaped like two hands, fully covering his eyes. Raneon stares at him intently from afar, confirming once and for all that he's a member of the Ernia Order. The monk slowly walks away from the door, surveying the damage around him. With measured steps, he approaches the place where several massive rocks had collapsed deep among the surrounding woods. Capitalizing on the enemy's distraction, Raneon silently sneaks up behind him. Within seconds, he swiftly knocks the monk unconscious and binds him tightly against the solid trunk of a nearby tree. Throwing on the enemy's dark robes, Raneon says he will borrow that golden mask for a moment. Disguised in the monk's clothing, he quietly slips through the main entrance of the tower. His blue eyes shine with fierce determination under the hood as he infiltrates enemy turf. Coming across a long dark staircase heading down, the mage realizes his theory was spot on. He then puts on the strange golden mask shaped like hands, carefully completing his disguise. Once everything is ready, the mage asks Elkan whether they should finally begin heading down the steps. The two start going down the massive stone stairs that seem to lead straight into the depths of the earth. The mage finally sets foot on the solid floor of an eerie cave packed with giant roots. He begins walking slowly through the dark place, mentioning that the atmosphere is definitely unusual. The mage looks around the space and realizes the huge cavern doesn't look man-made. He touches a pillar and notes that the area was formed entirely by hardened tree sap and roots. Elkan gets irritated by his reckless behavior and sharply warns him, telling him not to start touching random stuff. The spirit explains those glowing mushrooms are explosive and a single spark would trigger pure chaos. Raneon asks how his spirit partner knows all that, and the spirit fires back that he's lived thousands of years longer than him. The mage demands total silence when he suddenly hears an unfamiliar voice calling out to him in the cave. Two order monks walk up with firm steps, asking if he checked out what happened outside. Raneon lies smoothly, saying it was just a tiny landslide and that there was no real damage. The taller monk stares at him in silence for a second, looking like he finds that excuse suspicious. He then shifts the topic out of nowhere, preparing to ask the disguised mage another direct and unexpected question. Raneon feels a single drop of sweat slide down his face, nervously wondering whether his disguise has failed. However, the monk strangely asks what the bluish bird perched on his shoulder is supposed to be. The mage realizes he has grown so accustomed to Elkan that he completely forgot the spirit's presence would attract attention. Elkan senses the danger and quickly widens his eyes, pretending to be an ordinary, mindless bird. One monk keeps glaring at him, making it perfectly clear that he remains deeply suspicious of that unusual presence. The other monk gets startled and yells in annoyance, asking since when he's had a pet like that. The lead monk firmly scolds him on the spot, telling him he ordered him to never drop his guard like that. The startled monk immediately apologizes, trembling in fear over the severe reprimand he has just received. Raneon thinks to himself that even if he apologizes now, the leader definitely won't let it slide easily, but the leader just says there's no time to waste on dumb stuff and orders them both to follow him quickly. The mage nods along and shifts his curious glance straight to the metal box the monk is carrying. The leader mentions a new message just came in while opening the box, revealing a set of surgical tools. The note urgently demands they hurry up and send over the children's hearts as soon as possible. In Raneon's mind, the terrifying memory of that insane gaze demanding his own heart resurfaces. The leader notices his hesitation and shouts angrily, ordering him to hurry and catch up. Raneon cracks a faint smirk beneath his hood and calmly assures the furious monk that he is following along right behind them. no problem. As they go down, the scene reveals a dark, damp cell where the kidnapped kids are locked up together. In the middle of the gloom, a tiny fly buzzes quietly near the heavy rusted iron bars. The insect keeps slowly buzzing through the stuffy air, landing right near where the little prisoners are held. Suddenly, the fly lands on the chin of a mysterious guard who watches the children locked in the cell. Inside the dark cell, a crying little boy desperately calls out for his mum. Another child lies face down on the cold stone floor, completely exhausted and severely weakened by prolonged hunger. Several other boys and girls huddle in the corners of the cell, shaking from pure panic and misery. Suddenly, a loud metallic clatter echoes down the stone corridor, and the prison door starts opening. Bright light from outside floods the damp cell, exposing the silhouettes of the terrified kids. The three monks stride in menacingly, and the leader coldly announces that the prisoners are right there. The leader approaches the iron bars with a sick grin on his face, ready to begin the torture. He stares at the group of terrified kids and mockingly asks which one he should start with. Desperate screams for help echo off the enclosed stone walls as the gruesome preparations begin. Raneon watches silently behind his disguise, carefully studying every move the leader makes. One of the boys is forced down and handcuffed with arms spread wide on a cold stone table. The leader steps right up to the surgical table and cynically tells the poor kid not to worry. With a chilling smile, he cruelly promises that everything will be over in just an instant. The terrified boy starts crying hysterically, sobbing hard without any way to do a thing to break free from the chains. The executioner stretches out his black-gloved hand toward the disguised mage and bluntly commands him to hand over the knife. Raneon reaches inside, takes a razor-sharp dagger from the metal box, and slowly draws it out. The little boy shuts his eyes, sobbing in fear as the executioner's heavy footsteps move steadily closer to the table. The leader loses patience with the delay and shouts at his subordinate to hurry up. Instead of surrendering the blade, Raneon plunges it with all his strength into the leader's chest. Sending blood spraying across the cold room, he reveals his true power, instantly summoning a razor-sharp wind current around the wounded body. The leader screams in agony as he is blasted away by the devastating force of the wind magic. The other accomplice completely panics, letting out a painful groan and desperately asking who that guy is. The force of that sudden wind magic sends the leader's strange golden mask flying away. The mage extends his hand, stained with enemy blood, while keeping the wind spell active around him. With the room under his control, Raneon glares coldly and warns that only he asks the questions, while they can merely answer him. After realizing the danger, the second monk decides to flee and starts running desperately for his life. He races through the dark cavern, trying to put as much distance as possible between himself and that monster. The runner wonders who that guy is, and knows he must warn the others about the intruder fast. A horrifying scream of agony follows right after, echoing from somewhere on the other side of the stone hallways. The little prisoners inside the cell hear the wind crash and start shaking even harder in terror. The fleeing monk is caught off guard by a slashing wind blast that hits him with brutal force. Raneon expertly bends the air pressure to trap the runner in the middle of a terrifying whirlwind. With fresh blood across his face, the wind mage sternly demands to know where Klein is hiding now. The enemy bleeds heavily from deep cuts, screaming in unbearable pain. In total panic, the monk yells back, asking how the intruder knows such a top-secret name. The mage coldly says they have committed these atrocities under the holy name of the church. He then asks whether the current king also wants a young mage's heart so he can gain more power. While he speaks to the prisoner, the small wind spirit keeps spinning intensely around them. The monk lets out another ear-splitting shriek of pure pain as his skin gets sliced up by the violent cyclone. Raneon coldly steps closer and commands him again to reveal Klein's exact location immediately. With blood filling his mouth, the monk begs the wind mage to end his life once and for all. The mage meets him with a deep blue stare, showing zero intention of granting him any mercy. Facing the enemy's refusal, the whirlwind tightens and hurls the monk against the stone walls. The fallen monk laughs through his own blood, mockingly warning that his death will trigger the entire base alarm system. The man twitches violently, coughing up blood as the wind hurls him around. He gloats that the intruder forgot that another powerful mage remains in the base and won't make it back out of here alive. With a cold, defiant stare, Raneon snaps back that he would never forget a detail like that. The monk lets out his final desperate shriek before he is completely shredded by the wind's cutting power. Finally, the wounded villain collapses onto the cavern's stone floor, his robes completely soaked in blood. Raneon stays standing amidst all that blood, determined to push forward with his relentless search in the tower. He comments to himself that it's a real pain having to hunt them down one by one. The boy on the surgical table watches in shock as the mage walks calmly through the area. The mage starts dragging the bloody body of the defeated monk out of that dark room. Meanwhile, another monk on the upper floor begins blowing a massive alarm horn. The loud blast echoes through the underground base, sending several fighters running to see what happened. Multiple hurried footsteps begin pounding loudly through the dark, damp paths of the cavern. A squad of warriors gathers in the hall, asking in total confusion what's going on down there. One panicked fighter explains that a lone mage invaded the base and that Ahad was just taken out. The other monk looks stunned and asks whether the intruder came at the request of those forest villagers. Suddenly, their comrade's bloody body is hurled violently right in front of the gathered group. The man crashes onto the floor, groaning painfully and leaving all his allies completely speechless. Everyone freezes in shock when they look forward and see who is standing there in the darkness. Raneon steps ominously from the gloom and coldly asks whether everyone has finally gathered around him. The enemy leader grinds his teeth in anger, instantly realizing that this stranger is no ordinary opponent. He loses patience with his subordinates and orders them to attack the intruder as quickly as possible. One of the Order's mages starts casting a glowing magic circle to charge an attack from afar. The warriors rush in with swords drawn, yelling in pure rage to kill the intruder. However, the small spirit Ellie quickly appears beside Raneon to shield him from danger. With a single swift motion, the Wind Mage unleashes an incredibly powerful attack made of slicing air. The first enemy who tries to close the distance takes a direct hit and screams in agony inside the cave. The violent wind currents begin shredding several opponents all at once without showing them any mercy. Raneon uses his signature spiral technique, completely clearing the entire area in front of him. The enemy mage senses the danger, realizing in shock that he is facing a wind spirit contractor. Furious, he fires a beam of pink energy, screaming in rage for the intruder to drop dead. Raneon stays completely calm and unbothered while watching the massive energy blast speed directly toward him through the dark cavern. The energy beam slams into the ground with immense force, causing a huge explosion of dust and light. The enemy mage starts laughing hysterically in triumph, thinking the fight is already over right there. But as the smoke clears, he realizes in total shock that the intruder simply vanished without a trace. A spine-chilling cold sweat grips him as he senses a terrifying presence very close behind him. Raneon quietly materializes behind his opponent, wearing a look filled with pure coldness and death. The enemy breaks into a terrified sweat, unable to understand when the intruder moved. Giving zero time to react, Raneon unleashes a devastating wind strike that violently forces the stunned man to cough up fresh red blood. The mage realizes he must be the leader here and demands to know where the traitor Kleinheis is right now. The enemy spits blood and laughs, finding it hilarious that he asks about Klein instead of the children's safety. Suddenly, the cave ceiling begins to crack and massive stone blocks start crashing down hard. The monk mockingly says everyone here will be buried alive if no safety measures are taken fast. He proudly reveals he rigged the entire underground tunnel system of the base to automatically collapse. The cavern ceiling starts caving in with violent force, threatening to crush everything in sight. Massive stone pillars collapse all around, blocking the few remaining exits below. Raneon displays incredible agility as he smoothly vaults over one of the enormous pillars falling toward him. Meanwhile, the wounded monk tries to use all the cave-in chaos to slip away and escape. The mage locks his glowing blue eyes onto him and angrily yells that he isn't getting away. The monk laughs out loud and asks if he's really going to chase him, knowing the kids are going to get buried alive. However, the wind mage just keeps a look of absolute confidence facing the enemy's threat. He uses his powerful wind magic to launch himself forward, speeding right in front of the monk. The monk's eyes go wide in total despair, seeing the guy suddenly pop up right in his face. Meanwhile, the terrifying sounds of crumbling rocks keep echoing through the whole cave. Massive boulders keep falling from above, completely destroying the path they're moving through. The wind mage traps the monk's body in an orb of slicing air, making him groan in pure pain. Right after, he launches multiple sharp gusts of wind to control and redirect the falling ceiling debris. The lead monk is brutally battered by Raneon's cutting wind gusts and screams in pain. He collapses defeated and badly wounded on the cavern floor, desperately gasping for fresh air. The enemy mockingly asks if the mage is seriously looking for an emergency exit out of there. The monk laughs that it's way too late, and that everyone, kids included, is getting buried alive inside. Massive stone blocks and rubble keep crashing down with extreme force all over the cave ceiling. The entire structure begins collapsing rapidly, threatening to bury everything beneath it. Even the villain starts panicking at the sheer scale of the massive cave-in. Meanwhile, Raneon gathers a concentrated surge of wind magic between his bruised hands. He creates an enormous protective wind barrier that covers the entire area around the children. The ceiling completely gives way, but Raneon's powerful wind barrier successfully holds back all the dangerous debris. He firmly states that if there's no way out, he'll forge one himself to get everyone out safely. The monk stares at him in absolute awe, realizing the sheer scale of that great mage's destructive power. He thinks it's insane to forge an exit dozens of feet deep, but realizes with that mage, it's actually possible. The villain decides he'd rather die buried on the spot than get captured alive by that man. He begins activating one last forbidden self-destruct spell carved right onto his wounded body. Raneon immediately senses the enemy's unstable energy surge and jerks his head around. Suddenly, the monk glows with intense pink light before exploding in front of the mage's watchful eyes. The enormous blast knocks the wind mage backward, forcing him to release a sharp groan of pain. With his last breath, the villain tries to drag the mage down with him through that desperate underhanded final attack. Raneon realizes in shock that the monk carved the magic circle onto his body before the fight to trigger self-destruction. The mage quickly summons his spirit Elverin to help him contain the blast damage. Since it was too late to dodge the impact, he decides to block it all with his own defensive magic. The red magic self-destruct runes keep glowing on the executioner monk's lifeless body. Without hesitating for even a second, he firmly casts his defensive barrier known as Feather Shield. The terrifying pink explosion slams straight into the strong green wind barrier, sparking a massive flash. Hours later, small white birds chirp peacefully on the branches of a quiet forest. The top of the old stone tower now appears completely surrounded by a massive sunken crater. Suddenly the door of that stone structure bursts open from a heavy blast of light. A massive column of pink magic energy shoots into the sky, lighting up the surrounding forest completely. The internal path that was completely caved in before now sits open through a fresh, clear tunnel. All the smoke and dust slowly begin clearing inside the ravine beneath a brilliant blue sky. The wind mage takes slow, exhausted steps while making his way back toward the village. Heavily bruised and exhausted, he holds his injured arm while struggling to catch his breath. He admits he dropped his guard and would have been a goner if he took even a second longer to act during the fight. Raneon sighs in frustration over losing the only reliable lead on the enemy he had finally managed to locate. He questions what Klein is up to and why they were using the Ernia Order as a cover to pull off such evil deeds. He releases a long sigh, complaining that he can't think clearly with zero mana left in his body. The wind mage slowly raises his head, his bright blue eyes gleaming beneath the gentle daylight. He positions himself in the middle of a green clearing where a gentle breeze begins to swirl around him. Using the rest of his power, he forms a gentle whirlwind to lower the kids down from the sky safely. The little prisoners appear lying on the soft grass, sleeping peacefully and completely out of harm's way. Every single one of them is finally saved from that awful captivity, resting easy under the sunlight. Seeing all the children safe, Raneon cracks a subtle smile of relief. He concludes the rescue mission is completely finished and decides that it is definitely time for him to return directly to Ratville village. Back in the village, the locals spot him and cheer happily, respectfully calling him Master Mage. The couple rushes up to him, asking in shock why he's already leaving without taking a moment to rest up. The mage turns around with a gentle smile and softly replies that he still has a long road ahead. The man stammers, asking him to wait just one more brief moment before leaving the area for good. He holds out both hands, offering a bag of coins, asking the mage to accept proper payment for his help. The woman thanks him deeply for bringing the kids back, handing him a fresh food package for his trip. He stands chatting with the nice couple before finally continuing his journey down the road. He explains that usually, requests like this go through mercenary guilds and the pay works differently. The villager couple watches him with deep curiosity and surprise over the mage's honest explanation. However, he says he acted purely on his own personal whim, so he'll only accept the food. Time flies by, and a stunning sunset starts painting the entire sky in gorgeous golden shades. An old carriage travels peacefully down a dirt road under the late afternoon light. Elkin snaps his beak in irritation, clearly upset as he rests within the carriage. The spirit complains in disbelief, insisting that his reckless contractor must have officially lost his mind. He reminds Raneon that he summoned El Shooter right in the middle of the collapse to save the children while nobody could see. He points out that El Shooter is a high-level spirit and the summoning drained an enormous amount of mana. Elkan warns that if his mana ran out for even a second, everyone would have passed away right there. He makes it clear that even though he is the Spirit King, he can't save his skin every single time he slips up. Raneon listens calmly and calls his name softly, trying to soothe the spirit and calm him down for good. The mage chuckles and asks if the spirit is pouting because he summoned a different spirit instead of him in the fight. He apologizes with a smile, patiently explaining he simply had no other viable choice at that moment. The spirit lets out a long sigh, thinking he'd much prefer if that guy wasn't his contractor. He flaps his wings and changes the topic, asking what happened with the mysterious man he was hunting so hard. The mage admits he didn't find Klein, but reveals he managed to snag a valuable clue from the whole search. He holds up a scorched piece of paper and explains that it came from a letter mentioning the Gred Hill branch. The mage says Gred Hill is a thriving city and hosts a major branch of the widely renowned Ernia Order. Klein appears to be the monk's new client, and the order may discreetly cover his movements. The spirit nods thoughtfully, concluding that there must be a very strong connection between them. As the carriage rolls onward, Elkan mentions something about the mage that has made him curious for a while. He finally gathers courage to ask what that despicable client personally did to him long ago. An eerie silence takes over the inside of the carriage, following his direct question, leaving the companions feeling trapped in tension. The spirit watches him intently, waiting nervously for his young contractor's answer. Suddenly, the temperature drops, and a chilling wind aura causes everything inside the carriage to start shaking hard. Raneon gets a dark look in his eyes and clenches his fist in anger, remembering his past. 10 years ago, in the kingdom of Therys, 2 skilled swordsmen were locked in a deadly duel inside a grand arena. Metal swords clashed frantically, sending intense sparks flying into the air. The defeated opponent yells in rage, asking how he could do this after 10 years of pure loyalty. The bearded man answers with extreme coldness that a true warrior should only speak through his blade. Right after, the blade of his sword starts glowing bright with a terrifying red magic aura. With a single merciless blow, he unleashes a devastating slash that tears across the entire arena floor. The defeated swordsman's eyes widen in complete shock as that lethal attack strikes him. The strike splits his head down the middle without mercy, spraying fresh blood all across the arena floor as spectators react in horror. The warrior's lifeless body drops onto the stone floor, shocking everyone watching the duel from afar. The announcer proclaims Klein Heiss, captain of the Therys Royal Guard, as the grand winner of the honor duel. Klein calmly wipes his blade and mockingly declares that his sword delivered the final verdict. Suddenly, with a solemn voice, the herald announces the entrance of His Majesty, the elderly king of Therys. Old wrinkled hands decked out in flashy rings slowly start clapping for that cruel victory in the arena. The old king slowly walks up and mentions he came to watch the fight, but notes it ended way too fast. He asks if Klein is alright after taking down a former comrade, and Klein says useless swords should be snapped. The old king cracks a creepy smile and praises him heavily, calling him the true shield sword of the kingdom. Klein bows respectfully, stating he's merely a tool under the direct orders of the monarch. Years later, inside the massive banquet hall of the royal palace, a new mysterious secret meeting begins. With blood around his mouth, the old monarch angrily complains about the recent rebellion of some kingdom mages. He pierces a human heart with his fork and asks whether Klein knows the rumor about consuming mages' hearts. Kneeling at the far end of the lavish table, the captain replies that he has heard that terrible rumor. The king devours the bloody heart, morbidly confessing that he wants to become a powerful mage himself. The king of Therys tells Klein he understands his loyalty inside and out. He adds that keeping someone like Klein merely as Royal Guard captain is a waste, and believes he truly deserves at least a proper noble title himself. As the chat goes on in the palace, the bells start ringing loud from the top of the tower during sunset. Klein kneels before the monarch, firmly promising he'll execute everything without fail. With a sinister smirk, he promises to carry out every command of His Majesty's will. Years earlier, while training deep in the woods, a stern voice orders young Simon to lower his stance, straighten his back, and firmly plant his rear foot. Rouget looks down at the exhausted boy, sharply scolding Simon because he let his stance collapse yet again. Simon gets startled by the scolding as he tries to catch his breath, clutching his wooden sword. Diana asks if he's tired already, and Simon apologizes to his friend, admitting he feels like throwing up. Rouget laughs at the situation and suggests taking a quick breather, but Diana complains, saying she was just getting started. Suddenly, firm footsteps approach the training ground. Rouget notices the arrival and calls out a welcome, drawing the children's attention as they curiously look toward them. Raiden waves happily from afar, shouting Simon's name as he walks alongside a serious-looking man. Simon breaks into a huge smile and excitedly shouts Raiden's name upon seeing him arrive. However, his joyful expression instantly shifts into fear when he sees who is following behind. Raiden greets the older man, explaining that his dad finally came to visit. Klein throws a weapon to the ground without speaking, fixing the boy with a cold glare. His gaze remains stern and terrifying as he silently judges his son. With a cold, relentless voice, Klein orders Simon to restart the training right now. Time passes and darkness falls, while everyone nearby keeps hearing Klein repeat over and over for him to try one more time. Simon charges with everything he has, but his wooden sword bounces uselessly off his father's heavy armor. Exhausted, the kid can barely stand, while Klein just watches him in silence with his arms crossed. Simon pants heavily, trying to scrape together whatever strength he has left. Sweat rolls down his face while panic fills his blue eyes. Klein lifts his massive sword and coldly declares that the boy's attack wasn't worth the effort of dodging, and even questions whether Simon is truly his son. He strikes Simon brutally, sending the boy crashing into stacked wooden logs. Down on the ground and terribly bruised, the child groans in pain while coughing up fresh blood. Right then, the cabin door bursts open. Rouget rushes forward to check the injured child, furiously demanding to know what Klein thinks he is doing to a 9-year-old child like this. Klein coldly fires back, asking whether children don't pass away on the battlefield, and says Rouget has gone soft. He adds that his other 2 sons took the Royal Guard trial at that exact same age. Klein turns away with total disgust and declares that Simon is completely useless, leaving the frightened boy crying in fear. Later, food is served on top of the wooden table to try and smooth things over. Rouget asks if Simon is feeling okay, and the kid timidly nods yes, while getting support from his friends. Diana talks with her mouth full, saying she's going to beat that man up next time, but Rouget scolds her, calling her name. Raiden tries to comfort his brother, saying their dad didn't mean it, but Simon's sigh is over not being good at swordsmanship or Latin. Raiden smiles kindly and pushes back, saying Simon definitely has something he's super good at. He asks if Simon ever told their dad about his special ability to use spirit magic. Simon nervously tugs at his collar and confesses he didn't say a word because he gets terrified just looking at his dad. Raiden promises he'll try to talk to their dad about it, leaving Simon totally surprised and hopeful. He smiles warmly, reassuring him that their dad will definitely be thrilled with the news. However, a dark memory pops into his head, with his dad's voice ordering him to do something useful for once. Raneon wakes with a grim expression, still weighed down by the painful memories that remain buried in his past. In the present, he rides peacefully on a cargo wagon next to Elkan during the late afternoon. The blue bird notices his lingering silence and studies him thoughtfully for a few unusually quiet moments. Elkan drops the subject and suggests they talk later, explaining that he already understands most of what happened. A sudden change catches Raneon slightly off guard, and he looks surprised at his companion. He apologizes to Elkan for losing himself in the past, and admits he would have passed away as Simon if it wasn't for his trusted companion's timely help. Elkan tells him to forget it and grumbles that the summoning went wrong, leaving him in an incomplete form because he couldn't be summoned properly. Raneon gives a faint smile while listening to Elkan complain, and the wagon continues rolling along the road. The driver pulls the reins tight, forcing the horses to stop directly in the middle of the road. He calls back to Raneon, who is in the back with Elkan, saying it looks like an accident happened up ahead. Raneon gets confused by the heads up and wonders what could have happened on the road. He tells Elkan he's going to take a quick look at the situation and starts climbing down from the wagon. Walking through the woods, he spots a flashy carriage pulled over up ahead with a few people gathered around. Raneon walks up slowly to get a closer look at the situation and figure out the issue. He notices one of the wheels stuck in the ground, wondering if the dirt gave way because it was too weak. A guard apologizes to Priest Escott, explaining he's sent for help, but backup is going to take a while. Right then, Raneon approaches and asks if they are alright with their carriage. The guard startles and draws his sword, demanding to know who is there, but the priest asks the knight to hold on. Escott calms the soldier down, saying the young man seems to just want to lend a hand. Raneon checks out the priest closely as he walks over with a friendly face. Placing a hand on his chest, Escott wishes that Ernia's blessings be with the young traveler. Then, a small wind spirit pops up, floating in the air after being summoned by Raneon. With a soft breeze, the spirit's magic effortlessly lifts the heavy carriage that was stuck. The vehicle is set back down smoothly on solid ground under the watchful eyes of everyone there. Raneon studies the carriage and remarks with relief that the wheels thankfully don't look damaged. The guard is stunned by just how effortlessly the young traveler managed to lift something so heavy. Escott watches, intrigued, and comments that Ernia seems to have sent an unusual wind their way today. He walks slowly over to Raneon to thank him in person for the unexpected help. The priest smiles and says that thanks to the young guy, they managed to avoid a huge mess on the road. Raneon tries to act modest, saying he just did what any other passerby would do. Escott gently insists, saying even if the young guy thinks that way, help like that is always precious. The guy listens to his words in silence, just studying the churchman's attire. He locks his eyes on the priest as he begins to suspect the holy man's intentions. In that moment, Raneon remembers the Ernia church monks who used to kidnap helpless kids. He wonders if running into such an important church member out here in the middle of the road is just a coincidence. Determined to investigate further, Raneon asks the priest if he may pose a brief question. He mentions seeing several Ernia church monks in Ratville village and asks whether those monks travel there often. Escott repeats the name Ratville thoughtfully, showing a bit of surprise at the mention of the place. Looking around, he calmly states that Ernia's presence is spread everywhere. Next, the priest glances at him with suspicion and asks if something happened to bring that up. Raneon takes a step back and covers up, saying it's nothing like what he's thinking. He makes up that he found it impressive to see the church looking after such an isolated village, thinking to himself that he shouldn't rush things. The guard cuts into the chat, warning that they're running super late, and Escott agrees he needs to move. The priest walks back to the carriage as the door swings open for him to climb in. But right before getting inside, Escott suddenly stops, remembering an important detail. He says it was a wonderful encounter, but notes they didn't swap names, introducing himself as Escott and asking for the young man's name. Raneon is briefly caught off guard by the priest's surprisingly direct question. He answers calmly, sharing that his name is Raneon. A while later, night having fallen, the wagon driver announces they finally reached the destination. The horse lets out a huff of fatigue after the long walk down the dark road. The man mentions with a smile that the road splits from here, pointing out the directions. Raneon hands a few gold coins to the driver, who gets surprised and asks if it's really okay to take that much cash. The man thanks him, but worriedly warns that from the looks of it, getting into Gredhill won't be easy right now. Raneon and Elkan look at the man, intrigued, upon hearing that unexpected heads up. Raneon asks why it won't be easy to enter, and if something serious happened in Gredhill. He carries on by foot, down the dark stone road. As he slowly approaches the massive fortress, Elkan sniffs the air in disgust, complaining that the place reeks of a foul, nasty smell. Raneon looks at his partner with concern, agreeing that something terrible really seems to have gone down there. Raneon decides he shouldn't draw attention, and that it's better to head in solo from here. He walks up the steps toward the main entrance, while his footsteps echo against the stone walls. Along the path, several spiked wooden barriers are scattered around, as if blocking off a threat. Guards heavily armed with spears watch over the shut iron gates with intense focus. The entire entrance to Gredhill looks like a war fort, with extra security on the gates and atop the walls. Raneon walks calmly through the long stone corridor, approaching the gates under the suspicious glares of the guards. He checks out the barriers and thinks to himself that things definitely don't look normal around here. He remembers the rumor about a supposed judgment Ernia brought upon Gredhill and wonders what that means. The guy recalls the driver only knew distant rumors, keeping a dead serious expression facing the mystery. Suddenly, one of the wall guards shouts real loud for the young traveler to stop right where he is. The guard explains that to enter Gredhill, he needs to present a pass issued by the Ernia church itself. Raneon asks what he's supposed to do if he doesn't have that pass, but the soldier dryly answers he won't be getting in no matter what. He tries asking for more details on the situation, but gets cut off by a desperate scream coming from inside the gates. Hurried footsteps echo as someone runs frantically toward the city exit. A man flees from the guards, begging to get out, screaming he's the only one left to care for his mum. The soldiers chasing him shout for everyone to stay back, warning the man is in the final stage of judgment and shouldn't be touched. Raneon watches the chase with an extremely tense, serious face. He spots several blue crystals growing on the runner's skin, wondering if that's some kind of petrification. The man loses his strength and collapses hard onto the stone floor, right in front of the gates. He groans in pain on the ground, while the gate guard points his spear with hands shaking from pure fear. In total panic, the other guards shout orders for everyone to pull back inside the fort as fast as possible. A soldier tells Raneon to fall back immediately, but the young guy asks if they shouldn't try to help the fallen man. The man's hand starts shaking violently as the blue crystals spread terrifyingly across his skin. He cries in despair, lamenting that he still had so many things he wanted to do in life. With tears rolling down his face, the man's final words are an emotional plea for his mom. Suddenly, deep cracks start popping up around his eyes as the crystallization process speeds up. A massive blue crystal spike violently bursts out of the man's body, spraying blood everywhere, and some of it splatters across Raneon's face as he watches the brutal scene in complete shock. The crystal keeps expanding wildly, shattering whatever remains of the victim's body. Within seconds, the poor man is completely turned into a massive, jagged blue crystal statue. The locals watch everything terrified from afar, weeping and saying it's definitely a divine punishment. The man's crystallized hand remains frozen in the air, pointing static toward the full moon in the dark sky. A dark boom echoes through the area as the massive crystal pillar settles for good. Raneon slowly wipes his lip to clean off the blood that splattered on his face. He examines blood on his finger, disturbed to discover the petrification didn't start on the skin, but inside the body. He stares at the crystal statue in horror, realizing they call that atrocity a judgment. In the desperate crowd, a terrifying belief quickly begins spreading that the deity Ernia is furious with them all. Several citizens collapse to their knees in the middle of the street, screaming in absolute terror at Ernia's name, facing all this misery. A man slams his head against the ground so hard he starts bleeding, desperately begging for salvation. An elderly woman sobs and begs the deity for mercy, pleading for that sin to be taken from them. Back at the gate, the guards suddenly aim their sharp spears straight at Raneon. The young guy gets startled by the hostile reaction, not understanding why he's being surrounded like that. He asks, confused, why they're acting like this toward him out of nowhere. With a trembling face, the guard points at the young guy's cheek, stating he'll need to come with them because of his face. Raneon stays quiet, feeling the victim's blood slowly trickling down the side of his mouth. A mysterious voice echoes in his mind, declaring that the young visitor has now also been affected by the terrible judgment. Far away, the blind statue of Ernia sits solemnly on the church's main altar with its golden geometric symbol. A priest prays in front of the altar, asking that those facing the judgments manage to overcome the trial and be reborn. Several black-hooded monks pray on their knees right behind, asking that everyone remain under Ernia's command. One of the masked priests flashes a sinister smirk under his hood as he continues his quiet prayers. A mysterious figure in a black hood nimbly leaps off the top of the religious temple. The stranger lands smoothly and quietly observes the movement around the temple. From afar, he hears the whispered prayers and endless murmurs of the monks gathered in the church. The intruder keeps watching everything coldly, without making a single sound beneath his hood. With a fast, silent move, he leaps again and disappears into the dark night. Back at the gates, the guards keep their spears locked firmly onto Raneon. The mood gets insanely tense, while the fresh crystal statue rests right behind the soldiers. One of the guards shouts to his crew, warning that the young traveler is now undergoing judgment. Raneon wonders uneasily whether the contamination came from the victim's fresh blood that splattered on him. He locks his focus onto the soldiers, carefully calculating what to do next. Raneon charges a blast of wind magic in his hand, set on fighting back if things blow out of control. Suddenly, a loud commanding yell echoes through the area, catching everyone's attention. A firm voice orders everyone to stop attacking the young traveler immediately. The old woman who was crying on the ground looks up, surprised and relieved to recognize who's arriving. The guard announces out loud the arrival of the high priest, making Raneon look back surprised. The young guy turns his head, intrigued to see the man from the road approaching. Escort walks calmly through the iron gate, passing right between the guards who make way for him. The high priest steps up with a chill look, facing all that commotion with pure composure. The crowd cheers happily, shouting that the respected Lord Escort has finally arrived to help them out. Escort raises his hand and commands the guards to fall back, promising the young guy is fine despite the soldiers' protests. He smiles calmly and reassures the guards, saying God fully recognizes everyone's sincere, unwavering devotion. The priest quietly steps closer to Raneon and warmly remarks that their meeting on the road wasn't just a coincidence. The young guy uses a light breeze to clear the blood off his face, while admitting he didn't expect to run into him again so soon. Suddenly, a trembling, bloody hand tightly grabs the hem of the priest's flashy robes. The old woman drops to her knees at Escot's feet, begging for help in the middle of her despair. The monks try to pull the woman away, startled, but Escot calmly stops them, saying it's all right. Crying hard, the lady begs the high priest to pass the final judgment on that sinner once and for all. Escot glances sideways at the crystal statue and softly says, "The man's judgment hasn't ended yet." With an enigmatic smile, he claims his true judgment will only start when the grand day finally arrives. He turns his face peacefully, keeping a calm, mysterious expression facing that tragic situation. Escot turns to Raneon and asks if they shouldn't chat in a slightly more private, quiet spot. The young guy quietly accepts the invite, watching the religious leader's calm vibe with suspicion. The priest smiles and asks the young guy to let him return the huge kindness he received on the road earlier. The locals keep whispering in fear as they watch the two walk together toward the church. Now inside the temple, Escot calmly asks what brought the young traveler to the city of Gred Hill. Sitting in the main hall, Raneon calmly answers he's looking for someone, and the priest offers to help with whatever's needed. The two walk side by side down the massive silent hallways of the luxurious religious headquarters. Raneon subtly glances at the carved details on the temple walls, alert for any clues. Escot comments that the place is fairly modest, but invites the young guy to take a seat and share a cup of tea. The guy politely accepts the invite and genuinely thanks the church leader for the hospitality. The hot, steaming tea is delicately served into the porcelain cup resting on the coffee table. Escot apologizes for the guard's rudeness at the entrance. Explaining the city's state, he says tensions are complicated right now. Raneon asks if he's referring to the body crystallization phenomenon and questions if it's some kind of plague. The high priest takes a brief pause with the cup near his lips, seeming to weigh his answer. He sets the cup down and comments that since the young guy witnessed it all up close, it's only fair to explain the real situation. Raneon pays close attention to his words, keeping locked in so he doesn't miss a single important detail of the explanation. Escot stares at the steaming tea and firmly reveals that it definitely isn't a plague. He explains it's all nothing more than a giant misunderstanding birthed from people's fear, lamenting that not even he could set the record straight on that rumor. Meanwhile, Raneon quietly reflects while studying his own reflection in the tea, questioning why they locked down the city if it's just a misunderstanding run by the church. Raneon questions that if it really isn't a plague, then there's no actual reason to keep the city sealed off like that. Escott explains that the citizens are already so anxious and unsettled that any tiny new update frightens them, while seeing a stranger's face could easily trigger panic. Raneon shifts the topic and asks the priest what's going to happen to the man who collapsed back at the fort's entrance. Escott just gives an enigmatic smile and says the church itself is also still hunting for answers on the case. He explains there's a purification center inside the church that serves as a haven for those going through the trial. The priest promises that the folks in there are keeping up their fight against their judgments through super sincere prayers. He adds that he also prays for them every single day and trusts that in the end Ernia will eventually give the city a final answer. Later, Raneon walks alone, deep in thought, through the dark and quiet streets of Gredhill. The young guy looks back on Escott's explanation about people holding off the crystallization in the temples through faith. He also recalls the priest's confident promise that the deity would bring a fix to that awful situation. Raneon quietly processes this whole divine judgment story pushed by the Ernia church. He starts connecting the dots between Ratville, the Gredhill church, and the crystallizations, finding it impossible to dismiss everything as a coincidence. Suddenly, a loud sneeze coming from right behind startles him, making the young guy spin around fast, on high alert. Raneon spots Elkan on his shoulder and asks when he appeared. The bird answers that he simply popped into view right then. He asks, surprised, if spirits even sneeze, and Elkan chuckles, confessing he just tried to copy him because he felt forgotten again. The bluebird switches topics and asks the young guy what the game plan is moving forward. Raneon looks up at the temple towers and answers that, for now, he'll need to stick around in this city a bit longer. He states the priest is hiding something, but knows he can't pick a direct fight with the powerful Ernia church. The young guy concludes he'll need to find another way out, completely unaware that a mysterious figure is watching him from the alley shadows. Raneon senses a hostile presence right on top of him, his eyes going wide as he realizes the immediate danger. Before he can react, the attacker grabs him from behind out of nowhere and tightly covers his mouth to keep him from screaming. Elkan tries to help by buzzing around, while the young guy frantically fights to break free from that suffocating grip. Eyes burning with fury, Raneon pushes himself to gather energy and strike back against the cheap shot. He channels his wind magic to trigger a burst of compressed air and blow the attacker off him. However, the attacker moves fast and manages to clamp down hard on the young guy's arm, shutting down the counter. Raneon uses the momentum to dodge, leaping back to put a safe distance between them. The hooded man backs off slightly, grumbling about the wind's punch, but quickly gets back into his fighting stance. The attacker drops a sarcastic laugh, commenting on the young guy's terrible luck for running straight into his path. He boasts that he knows someone who has mastered that exact same wind magic inside and out, which is why he can counter it so easily. The man pauses for a beat to study Raneon's face, commenting he looks just like the coward he knows. Raneon lets out a tired sigh and plainly reveals his identity to the attacker, making it clear it's his buddy Edward. The mercenary's expression widens in complete shock upon finally recognizing his old comrade's instantly familiar voice. Edward yells Raneon's name in surprise, asking what on earth he's doing here in this city. He laughs excitedly over the reunion and playfully greets Elkan, while Raneon complains, asking for an apology. Edward drops a loud laugh and jokes that the cheap shot was just his way of rolling out the welcome mat. The two sit down on the alley floor to talk, and Raneon asks what brought Edward out to the Gredhill area. Edward Boker, a mercenary from the Gromant group, casually laughs that a soldier of fortune always goes where the cash is. Raneon remembers meeting Edward a year ago, back when he joined the mercenary crew to track down Klein Heiss. Back then, Edward messed with the young guy a ton, thinking he was just a spoiled weakling who lived with his nose in books. The big guy grabbed him by the collar and cockily promised he'd turn Raneon into a real-deal mercenary. Raneon recalls the exhausting chores he was forced to do solo, like picking delicate magic flowers without using a drop of magic. He also remembers the dangerous gigs against bandits, where Edward would swipe extra loot to lock in his own bonuses. The guy concluded Edward was the exact type of wild, troublemaking mercenary he should have never gotten mixed up with. Back in the present, Edward asks what the young guy's connection is with the High Priest and why he gets treated so special. Elkan watches a small stick that fell on the ground, while Edward stands impressed, seeing the magic creature up close. Edward confirms he knows Escott's reputation. He says nobody can live in Gredhill and not know who the church's high priest is. Raneon explains he has zero links to the church and just helped the priest with a carriage breakdown on the road. The young guy switches topics and shows off a detailed sketch of Klein Heiss, asking if his buddy ever saw that guy around the priest. Edward checks out the former captain's portrait real close, his face flipping to a dead serious, focused look. Edward stares at the drawing of Klein, totally shocked, mumbling that he knows that face all too well. A second later, he covers it up with a wave of his hand and lies, saying he's never seen him, asking if Raneon's goal is also to find someone. Edward leans back against the wall, commenting that either way, it was huge luck bumping into him here in the alley. He confesses he was actually in desperate need of a support guy like Raneon, hoping to find a mage to give him cover. Edward says his current job connects back to the church, but notes that not even the king dares mess with the Ernia Order lightly. With a wide grin, he offers Raneon a lucrative, once-in-a-lifetime chance to join him on that dangerous mission. Completely ignoring his buddy's pitch, Raneon turns his back and starts walking off solo down the dark city street. Edward is left with his hand hanging in the air, totally speechless and mad over getting ditched without a single reply. He scratches his head frustrated on the ground, grumbling that things didn't go down quite like he drew them up in his head. Night rolls deeper over Gred Hill, leaving the city backdrop even quieter and creepier under heavy clouds. Raneon keeps walking through the streets while the locals back off terrified, whispering in fear that he might spread the disease. Tired from all the walking, the young man pulls up in front of an inn, hoping to find a safe place to sleep for the night. He politely knocks on the wooden door, but the owner angrily shouts from inside, warning the place is closed. The bald innkeeper was passed out sleeping with crossed arms behind the counter before getting woken up by the knock. Raneon pushes the door open and steps inside, calmly asking if they still have any clean rooms currently available for the night. Looking at him, the innkeeper panics and recognizes him as the young man from the gate earlier. Panicked, the innkeeper grabs a broom handle and orders the traveler to leave immediately. He keeps the makeshift weapon raised, shouting that rooms remain completely unavailable and refusing to let the young man stay. Day breaks over Gred Hill, painting the sky in soft orange tones behind the sharp towers of the massive cathedral. Elkin complains he's starting to get a headache from the city's nasty stench, and Raneon agrees the vibe here is awful. Sick of the bad smell, the bird mentions he's going to take a quick rest and vanishes in a puff of green wind. Raneon sighs at the locals' panic, concluding he won't have a choice except to spend the night sleeping on a street corner. Suddenly, a young friendly voice calls out to him from behind, making the guy turn around curious to see who it is. A cheerful redhead girl walks up, noting he looks like he couldn't land a room, and offering to help him out. Raneon asks, suspicious, if it's really okay, commenting that everyone else in town seems to be running away from him. The girl excitedly holds his hands and says they do that out of sheer ignorance, since nothing about the disease has been proven for real. She introduces herself as Enoch and reveals her family owns an inn nearby, while the young guy says his name is Raneon. The two walk together until they pull up in front of a rustic wooden sign marking the inn's entrance. Enoch throws open the door with energy to show off the place to her new, unexpected customer. The young redhead pulls Raneon inside and happily shouts to her mom, announcing they finally got a new guest in the house. Enoch's mom smiles super welcomingly from behind the counter and greets the young guy. Raneon looks around and notes that while the inn is a bit old, the setup is super quiet and real clean. He does the mental math that a room in a big city like this usually runs around 5 gold coins. The guy thinks that family took him in warmly when everyone else turned him down, plus he notes the place has no customers. He decides to drop an extra stash of gold coins on the two women as a genuine way to show his thanks. However, Enoch holds out her hands happily and charges a rate of 100 gold coins for just a single night's stay. Raneon unfreezes completely, shocked to hear such a rip-off price for a simple room like that. The girl's mom pops up furious behind the counter and yells, calling Enoch out for trying to hustle the customer. Embarrassed, she apologizes to the young guy and explains that the real room rate is actually just 5 gold coins a night. Enoch pouts, annoyed at getting called out, while Raneon just stares at her with a completely stunned look. The guy smiles and willingly hands over 10 gold coins, saying he would have slept on the street if not for her daughter's help. The mom thanks him, relieved, and gets ready to show him upstairs, but Enoch quickly grabs the keys, insisting that guiding guests is her job. The red-headed girl runs excitedly toward the stairs, cheerfully winking at her mom and telling her to go take a break. The woman agrees and leaves the task to her daughter. Right at the top of the stairs, Edward suddenly appears, coming down sleepily and scratching his head. Seeing the newcomer, Edward comments that another guest arrived just as he thought the inn might go under. He lets out a loud yawn and stretches, complaining the cheap bed left his entire body aching, but that it did the job for the night. Mid-yawn, the mercenary locks his eyes onto the young guy and freezes up on the spot, going completely stunned. Edward points his finger at his buddy in shock, yelling Raneon's name out loud, seeing him right there in the hallway. Raneon slaps a hand to his forehead, exhausted, deeply sighing over his terrible luck, ending up at the exact same inn as him. Meanwhile, in the cozy common room of the inn, a fireplace burns logs, with an iron pot heating up over the fire. In the inn's kitchen, a ladle serves hot soup with small pieces of bread out of a massive pot. Enoch carries the tray with food toward the table, where Edward and Raneon are chatting back and forth. The girl sets the bowls of onion soup and cornbread onto the wooden table, with a sweet smile on her face. Edward complains that eating the same menu for 2 weeks straight is too much, startling Enoch, who immediately calls for her mum. The girl's mum pops up holding a broom and scolds her, ordering Enoch once again to go rest right now. Edward grabs Raneon's outfit while he complains about the discomfort, but the mercenary explains he's doing it to keep him from bolting again. Elkin pops out in a gust of wind asking what the two are up to, getting playfully greeted by Edward. While eating, Edward asks in a low voice if Enoch tried to charge an insane rate for the room, leaving Raneon unsurprised. He explains the girl is hustling hard to get cash to pay his fee, since the empty city has 0 tourists. Raneon gets confused by the mention of a fee, and Edward breaks down that it's the major gig he tried telling him about yesterday. As they chat, Enoch wrings out a wet cloth into a wooden bucket full of water at the back of the hall. Edward reveals quietly that the girl's dad mysteriously vanished without a trace a while back. He comments on how much her heart must ache, but points out Enoch acts cheerful just to keep her mum from worrying. Edward whispers he followed a few leads on the disappearance and found out the case seems tied to the Ernia Order. Raneon gets startled hearing the Order's name, wondering if the case is somehow connected to Priest Escott. Edward drops his empty bowl on the table and admits he hasn't been able to dig up many details on the mystery yet. He downs the rest of the soup and comments that the story in the end is probably just the same old cliched job as always. He suggests the so-called saintly high priest of the big church is probably pulling off some dirty work behind the scenes. In the cathedral, prayers carry on before Ernia's blind statue, asking for strength to push through the pain and trials of judgment. Escott leads the prayers before the kneeling crowd, begging for the deity to guide the people toward her holy light. The high priest keeps a chill smile on his face, while his hooded assistants keep a close eye on him. The contaminated believers start screaming and weeping in pain as the crystallization creeps further across their bodies. Escott walks calmly among them, preaching that Ernia already knows the fear of everyone facing the trial inside out. The people keep groaning in pain on the temple floor, while the priest softly states that suffering is just a process. He sets his hand on a frantic follower's head, reassuring her the pain will stop once she overcomes fear and balance returns. The religious leader claims everyone will finally be healed, soothing the suffering of the followers kneeling before him. With a look of pure worship, Escott calls on the whole crowd to pray intensely for the arrival of the grand day. The temple fills up with a mystical vibe as the prayers keep rolling under the dim candlelight. Back at the inn, the empty bowls are stacked up on the wooden table after the two wrap up eating. Raneon teases his buddy for scarfing it all down despite complaining about the menu, and Edward defends himself by saying a mercenary needs proper fuel. At the counter, the mum asks Enoch to head upstairs and get some rest, but the girl insists her mum should be the one lying down. Suddenly the woman's face turns to sheer panic, her eyes going wide with unbearable pain. She lets out a groan of agony and falls heavily against the wooden counter, her legs giving out. Edward tries to keep talking about the job, but he and Raneon get cut off by the sudden noise of the drop. Enoch screams in despair for her mum upon seeing her fall unconscious behind the front desk. Edward dashes instantly to help, yelling for Raneon to use any kind of healing magic to save her. The woman twitches in pain on the floor as a terrifying blue crystallization starts rapidly creeping up her leg. Sharp blue crystals start ripping through her leg skin with a terrifying violent snap. The process moves forward relentlessly, covering the woman's ankle with the same glowing crystals they saw back at the gate. Far away from there, Escott slowly walks down the steps of a dark, damp stone staircase beneath the temple complex. He steps firmly onto the stone floor as he reaches the end of the quiet, gloomy descent. The priest steps inside a massive, dark stone chamber tucked away from the rest of the church. He walks in measured steps toward the center of the deserted, eerie underground hall. A hooded monk silently steps out from the shadows, respectfully greeting him upon noticing his arrival. The assistant reports having confirmed the visitor named Raneon is indeed the Wind Mage under contract with the Spirit King. Hearing the major reveal, Escott freezes in place and covers his face with both hands in silence. He stays locked in that exact position for a few moments, processing the big news he just got. Voice trembling, the high priest begins spouting a frantic prayer to his deity. He throws his arms up in ecstasy, celebrating with an insane smile the fact that Ernia sent a fresh light to guide his calling. Standing before several statues of crystallized believers in the chamber, Escott declares he received the mission to restore world balance. Escott gets super hyped, thinking that with Raneon by his side, he'll be able to hit his grand goal even faster. With that divine legion, he believes the day to forge a world where only mages exist is drawing closer and closer. Meanwhile, at the inn, Raneon tries everything he can to treat Enoch's mum, who remains lying in bed under everyone's worried eyes. Enoch watches the situation with a heavy heart, while the spirit Elkan remains right beside him on the bed. Raneon uses his wind magic, called Breeze, to try to ease the pain and contain the crystals on the woman's leg, but suddenly he realizes, startled, that his healing magic is simply having no effect on the patient. He wonders why this is happening, and feels his own mana being pushed right out of her body. Enoch's mother regains a bit of consciousness, and says she has a very important favor to ask Raneon. She begs him not to tell anyone about the fact that she is going through the crystallization trial. The woman explains that anyone who begins the trial must enter the church's purification center, just as Escott had said. She cries, thinking that if she is taken there, Enoch will be left completely alone, with no one to care for her. Raneon comments that he has heard of this purification center, and asks why there is so much despair if the place is supposed to be a healing sanctuary. The mother reveals that no one is allowed visitors at the purification center, and that to this day, not a single person who entered has ever returned. Edward crosses his arms and comments that this sounds extremely fishy, pointing out that Enoch's father is also involved with the Order. Raneon asks her to rest since she has already overexerted herself, and the woman thanks him, saying the pain lessened thanks to his efforts. She thanks him once more for his invaluable help, and finally introduces herself, revealing that her name is Iris. At that moment, Raneon shares his own name, so she knows who he is as well. Elkan observes Iris closely and says she is very strange, as she has no mana, yet possesses the strong aura of a light spirit inside her body. Raneon is completely taken aback to hear about the light spirit, and Elkan explains that this was precisely why his magic did not work. The spirit explains that her body is already completely filled with a different kind of mana. Raneon calls out to Elkan and begins to wonder if this trial might actually be a human creation rather than an ordinary illness. Elkan admits he does not know everything, but affirms one thing is for sure: a spirit's aura could not naturally reside there. The spirit reinforces that this would never happen in the body of a human whose mana flow has completely vanished. Faced with this intriguing revelation, Raneon remains silent, wondering what could truly be going on behind the scenes. Suddenly the room door begins to creak open slowly, interrupting his thoughts. Enoch appears at the doorway, terrified, and warns that the monks of the Order are downstairs in the inn, looking for the Wind Mage. Downstairs, Edward confronts the monks and tells them to take those masks off their faces and get out immediately. The monk tells the mercenary to step aside because he has no business with him, but Edward threatens him, telling him to shut his mouth. As Edward complains about being ignored, the monk calls out Raneon and says the high priest wishes to meet with him in person. The messenger adds that the religious leader has a matter of great importance to discuss directly with the mage. Edward turns around and tells Raneon to head back upstairs, assuring him that he will handle this annoying situation himself. To Edward's surprise, Raneon walks right past him and commands the monks to guide him to the temple immediately. Edward is left completely confused, seeing his friend make such a sudden and risky move right in front of the enemy. The mercenary just watches, concerned, as Raneon calmly walks alongside the hooded followers of the Order. Raneon asks Elkan to scout the inside of the temple, explaining that his exploration magic is not working in that area. Elkan flies off grumbling, saying it is ridiculous for a spirit king to be doing the chore of a low-level spirit. With his companion on a scouting mission, the protagonist opens the massive wooden doors of the church's main temple. He knows that all the mysterious incidents he has witnessed so far lead right back to the hidden secrets of Ernia's doctrine. He feels the air in there is extremely heavy, and notices that even Elkan's aura has weakened upon entering that sacred place. Escott thanks him for the visit and asks whether he should call him Raneon or by the famous title of Wind Mage that he carries. The high priest slowly rises and comments that elemental magic can only be channeled through a spirit contract. He smiles and pays his respects for finally meeting in person the only mage capable of forging a pact with the Spirit King. Faced with such reverence, the protagonist comments firmly that the religious leader seems to know a lot about the lives and secrets of mages. The protagonist explains that he accepted the invitation because he also has a crucial question he wants to ask the priest directly. He takes a few more firm steps into the immense stone hall and calls the high priest's attention in a very serious manner. Without beating around the bush, the protagonist asks face to face if the terrible trial plaguing Red Hill was created by the priest's own hands. Escott lowers his head slightly for a brief moment and maintains a calm expression, showing no surprise or annoyance whatsoever. Escott says someone formed a contract with the light spirit, but leaves its holder unclear. Raneon's eyes widen, and he stands completely frozen in utter shock before him. Escott calmly walks past him and asks if the Wind Mage, who has always fought for the people, has ever stopped to truly reflect on this. Escott questions why mages must be so few in number across the entire world. He explains that for a long time, humans feared and rejected what they did not understand, causing many mages to be hunted down and disappear. However, the priest points out that whenever those people needed help, they never hesitated to seek them out. To him, the current order is completely upside down, allowing inferiors to rule and stand above superiors. The protagonist demands to know whether this ridiculous belief is why innocent people are turning into crystal statues and ultimately perishing. Escott responds calmly that those people did not perish, but were chosen for a noble calling and should be deeply grateful for it. He then declares his firm intention to fix this completely inverted world order once and for all. The priest proclaims that this is Ernia's sacred calling, and claims that in a proper world there will be no room for anyone who is not a mage. The protagonist stands shocked in silence as he begins to connect the dots about what is truly behind this entire plan. He asks aloud if all this madness is truly the genuine will of the entire Order of Ernia. With an enigmatic smile on his face, Escott answers that it is not yet the general will of the organization. He explains that he is the only one in the church who understands this calling, but assures that the others will follow once he paves the way. The leader reveals that other mages are already taking action to change the world, and that the union of their wills will make that grand day arrive. Escott extends his hand to the protagonist and invites him to fulfill this glorious revolutionary calling of Ernia alongside him. The protagonist keeps his head down for a moment before calling the high priest back in a stern tone. He pulls out a poster with Klein Heiss's face and asks if that man is also participating in this same calling. Escott remains silent for a brief moment and asks if Klein Heiss was precisely who the protagonist was searching for. The priest explains that he and Klein came from the same origin, but ended up bearing slightly different fruit throughout their lives. The protagonist decides to cut the conversation short right there and begins to release his powerful magical energy around his body. He raises his right hand to summon his powers and cast wind magic against his opponent. However, the young mage is startled to realize that his mana is simply not gathering as it should. He breaks into a cold sweat and remembers the strange, heavy feeling he felt as soon as he set foot inside that temple. The protagonist tries to force his magic once more, but the remnants of wind merely scatter uselessly across the floor. To make matters worse, he can no longer feel Elkin's presence and wonders if his guardian spirit was forced back to the spirit realm. Escott observes him with his back turned and calmly comments that this place is considered the most sacred site in the entire church. He opens his arms with a welcoming smile and reveals that this grand room is his own personal prayer chamber. The religious leader explains that this entire space was built specifically to completely suppress the flow of mana. The goal is to ensure that absolutely no one can be an exception or use magic in the presence of their deity's sacred word. The protagonist is left stunned to learn that it is actually possible to create an artificial environment capable of blocking mana like this. He lowers his head as he hears heavy footsteps slowly approaching him through the darkness of the hall. Escott mentions that he grew very curious upon learning about the cave in beneath Ratville, and wondered what kind of person could accomplish such a feat. He confesses that now that he has met him in person, his heart is beating so fast he can barely focus on his church duties. Meanwhile, in the center of town, the movement of the people continues peacefully under the moonlight. The high priest looks up toward the large window and says he has finally obtained the absolute certainty he had been seeking. He smiles gently as he declares he was certain he had found the perfect companion for his grand journey. Before the young man can react in time, Escott grabs the protagonist's hands with extreme delicacy yet firmness. With an almost feverish gaze, the priest says he desperately needs the Wind Mage's help to complete his plans. Raneon yanks his hands away with a sharp pull, utterly rejecting that touch and that absurd proposal. He shouts in anger, stating that all of this is complete insanity, and demands to know once and for all his true connection to Klein Heiss. Faced with the mage's aggressive reaction, Escott simply closes his eyes and maintains his completely calm and unbothered posture. He softly offers to explain the situation again in case it is too difficult for the protagonist to grasp right away. Suddenly, The large wooden gates slowly open as a voice from outside commands everyone to treat him with the utmost respect. The wind moves ominously through the dark corridors, blowing out the glow of the last candles illuminating the place. The protagonist suddenly finds himself surrounded by several hooded monks of the order, holding lit candles in the pitch darkness. Outside the church, the quiet streets of Gred Hill are already nearly deserted under the dark night sky. Edward walks through the town, carrying a heavy crate of supplies. Noticing several local residents whispering fearfully around him, the mercenary begins to find this whole secretive atmosphere very suspicious and slows his pace to try and figure out what is wrong. He remembers the protagonist setting off quietly toward the temple, accompanied by his faithful guardian spirit, Elkan. Edward thinks his friend must have a good reason for going there, and wonders if he should head back to his mercenary group's camp. Suddenly, he spots a few monks of the order talking near one of the houses, reassuring the people that the high priest will always pray for them all. Elderly citizens bow gratefully and thank the high priest for his grace, while praising the monks for their diligent work. Edward watches the scene from afar, wondering what is truly happening behind so much blind devotion from the locals. He returns to the inn and sets the heavy crate full of fresh supplies down onto the wooden table with a thud. Edward explains he brought that food to help them. Since Iris has a crystallized leg, it would be impossible for them to go out for provisions. Iris thanks him from the bottom of her heart for such kindness, but the mercenary grumbles that he only did it because he could not stand eating plain bread and soup anymore. Next, Edward mentions he saw the priests walking the streets, claiming they were on a pilgrimage, and asks what they actually do. Upon hearing the mercenary's question, the two women look at each other with deep concern and a clear sense of tension in the air. Iris explains that this pilgrimage exists so the monks can find all those who have entered the trial and send them to the purification center. Outside, the firm footsteps of the hooded monks echo sinisterly along the stone sidewalks of the quiet town. Enoch panics upon hearing the footsteps approaching and yells for her mother to run and hide immediately. Iris quickly grabs her daughter's hand to try and escape, but the terrifying shadows of the intruders are already projected across the inn's entrance. The monks burst in and declare they have come to bring the high priest's will and check if the family is facing difficulties with the trial. Edward remains standing right in front of them, with arms crossed, glaring at the intruders with a serious, intimidating look. Despite the mercenary's presence, the monks quickly surround Iris and little Enoch in the middle of the inn's wooden hall. One of the order's followers calmly places his hand inside his dark robe to pull out a mysterious item. He raises his right hand, revealing a glowing blue crystal, and softly asserts that it represents the will of the High Priest of Ernia. Enoch freezes in absolute terror upon seeing that mysterious crystal glowing so intensely right before her eyes. The monk observes the two terrified people with suspicion and lets out a quiet whisper, calmly trying to understand the situation. The girl tries to hide her extreme fear as cold sweat runs down her face under the threatening gaze of the enemies. She thinks frantically that if that crystal got close, it would start glowing intensely upon detecting the infection in her mother's leg. Iris clenches her hands tightly, praying in silence that the monks do not notice her terrible condition under any circumstances. Suddenly, one of the monks appears right behind her and whispers, asking why she is trembling so much in this moment of trial. He wears a malicious smirk beneath his dark hood and taunts that she looks like someone who would burn upon contact with the divine light. The monk extends the glowing blue crystal toward them and calmly claims there is absolutely nothing to fear in the face of such a blessing. He cynically assures that the high priest will embrace and heal all the suffering they are feeling in their hearts. However, Edward completely loses his patience and suddenly steps in, grabbing the monk's arm with extreme force to stop him. The mercenary asks what on earth they think they are doing bothering a sick woman, and the monk shouts indignantly, accusing him of heresy. Another fanatical follower lunges furiously at the mercenary, screaming that he will put an end to him in the name of their deity, Ernia. Edward delivers an overwhelming kick that sends the monk flying back, declaring that the only thing he truly believes in is his own name. The leader of the monks shouts furiously, ordering the others to examine the woman immediately, emphasizing that it is a direct order from Escort. The other followers respond hastily and grab Iris roughly by the arm, causing her to let out a painful scream on the floor. Enoch tries to help her mother break free, but ends up being shoved hard and collapses heavily onto the wooden floorboards. One of the monks approaches the mercenary and murmurs threateningly that the high priest will never forgive this grave offense against the church. Edward grits his teeth in rage at it all and bitterly says that they are nothing but a completely insane bunch of dangerous religious zealots. The warrior moves with incredible speed and launches a devastating counterattack against the monks who are holding the family. He then lands an unbelievably powerful punch that sends one of the stunned enemies flying backward straight into the wooden walls of the hall. The monk hits the structure so violently that he cracks the wall and slumps bleeding onto the floor, groaning in agony after the beating he took. Edward simply watches the defeated opponent with coldness, while the other follower of the order watches the terrifying scene, sweating in fear. Even after the chaos, one of the monks shouts in ecstasy upon confirming up close the terrible crystal infection on Iris's leg. Meanwhile, in the dark dungeon of the church temple, young Raneon remains with his head bowed and eyes closed in deep silence. Suddenly, he opens one of his glowing blue eyes in the deep darkness, showing that he has not yet lost hope. The young mage maintains an expression of extreme seriousness and focus as he analyzes his options to escape that situation. He finds himself tightly bound to a large chair with heavy metal chains, positioned right above a massive pile of blue crystals. Raneon himself looks up and comes face to face with the terrifying sight of dozens of human bodies completely transformed into crystal statues. He is in complete shock to realize that those were all the innocent people from Gred Hill who had recently gone missing. Raneon himself recalls the sick words of the high priest, who said those people were not gone, but rather fulfilling a noble calling. The mage realizes there are so many victims there that counting them would be impossible, and wonders what will actually happen if they truly have not perished. Faced with such cruelty, young Raneon begins straining his arms and squirming in a desperate attempt to break the metal bindings. However, the heavy iron shackles and chains binding his wrists only tighten further against his skin with a metallic clatter. He realizes he is completely unable to summon any wind to help him shatter the chains in that mannerless room. Escott tells young Raneon that all those crystal statues actually form the legendary Divine Legion. He explains that this legion will help him create a perfect world of mages by filtering out those who are not magically gifted whatsoever. The priest brings a piece of meat to his mouth and calmly states that they are merely awaiting the right moment to act. Raneon himself glares at him with rage and deep revulsion. Raneon whispers the high priest's name. With tremendous indignation, he asks directly if Escott's sick plan is truly to cold-bloodedly eliminate all the residents of that town. Setting his fork aside, Escott responds softly that the word eliminate is a very inaccurate term for what he is doing. He asserts that Gred Hill is the starting point of his glorious calling, and that the town will transform into his very own holy land. Raneon himself furiously questions what he has to say about the many innocent children who were taken and suffered in Ratville. Escott turns slightly and asks calmly if Raneon himself has ever heard of an ancient and dark rumor. The priest mentions the absurd rumor that any ordinary person could become a mage by consuming the heart of a young sorcerer. Upon hearing those dreadful words, Raneon's own eyes widen in complete shock and deep horror before the villain. Back at the inn, the crystal reveals Iris's infection, and the monks exclaim triumphantly that she was indeed struck by the trial. The leader of the monks yells orders to take the woman to the temple immediately, but is suddenly cut short by a powerful blow. Edward unleashes a brutal sequence of physical attacks against the hooded followers of the order, without showing a shred of mercy. Another attacker is hurled violently away, sliding across the inn's wooden floor from the impact. Edward stands firm amidst the dust of the brawl, while the remaining enemies stare at him, their legs trembling from sheer terror. He grabs the next opponent with ease and slams him with all his strength against the wooden floor of the inn. Then, completely terrified by the mercenary's power, the last monk calls him a lunatic and tries to flee the scene in a panic. But Edward is far too fast and firmly grabs the fugitive's dark cloak from behind to stop his escape. He raises his clenched fist and lands a devastating punch that knocks the enemy out cold on the floor instantly. All the remaining attackers end up defeated and groaning in pain, scattered across the floor, while Edward takes a deep breath after the intense battle. Suddenly, the mercenary hears a noise coming from the entrance and turns quickly with clenched fists, ready for another round. Several town guards armed with spears burst into the room, shouting and demanding to know the meaning of all that chaos inside. They point their sharp spearheads directly at Edward's chest and authoritatively command him not to move. The injured monk drags himself with difficulty across the cracked floor, groaning in agony as he tries to prop himself up near the mercenary. The bloodied monk points toward Iris and commands the guards to drag that sinful woman out of there immediately. He shouts furiously that she is an unholy sinner who committed the grave crime of hiding her crystal infection from the church. Edward grits his teeth at such blatant injustice and remarks to himself that this town is a complete disaster. He recalls his leader's warning not to cause trouble and thinks with a wry smile that Roy will surely want to tear him apart for this. He cracks his knuckles in resignation, thinking that it is too late anyway, and that he always ends up stuck with the worst job. The mercenary prepares to fight all the guards, and says in a taunting tone that he was starting to get bored anyway. The fallen follower of the order points enraged at Edward, and commands the town guards to arrest that man as well. He screams in fury, demanding they escort the mercenary immediately under heavy guard, straight to the religious order's main headquarters. The soldier looks confused and asks whether they should take him instead to the town's common prison, but the monk angrily replies that he beat up 4 of their men. The cleric adds that for insulting Ernia's name, the order itself will make sure he pays personally for all this insolence. Upon hearing that his prison destination would be the order's headquarters itself, Edward shifts his posture and grows thoughtful for a moment. He focuses his gaze and begins hatching a quick plan in his mind, realizing that an arrest order might actually make his life a lot easier. The warrior breaks into a broad, confident smile upon realizing they are handing him a free pass straight into the enemy hideout. In front of the confused soldiers, Edward simply raises his hands to signal a truce and peacefully offers to surrender. He wears a mischievous grin on his face and repeats out loud that he is surrendering completely voluntarily to their arrest. The soldiers then tie Edward's and Iris's wrists with tight ropes and begin escorting them out of the inn under Enoch's watchful gaze. Iris walks with her head down and hands bound, turning one last time to give a tender, sad look to her beloved daughter. With tears streaming down her face, she whispers Enoch's name, her heart completely breaking at having to leave her there alone. Enoch cannot hold back her tears and begins sobbing heavily in despair as she watches her mother being led away by the guards. Edward notices the little girl's extreme sadness and tells her in a gentle tone not to look so sad or disheartened by everything. He flashes his classic confident smile and guarantees he will get the job done, promising to bring both her mother and her father back. Hearing the strong mercenary's solemn promise, the young girl wipes her tears with her arm and agrees with a firm nod. The guards shout orders for everyone to start marching and begin escorting the prisoners toward the temple headquarters. The heavy wooden door closes with a loud thud, leaving young Enoch completely alone and in silence inside the dark hall. Back in the dungeon, Escott repeats the rumor that consuming the heart of a young sorcerer grants powers, calling it a foolish belief. He stares at the young mage and asks if he has any idea how many children died in terrible agony in the past. A dark flashback shows a village completely consumed by flames, with several bodies scattered across the dirt ground. Ruthless, smiling men are seen kidnapping small, defenseless children amidst the chaos and fire. Escott recalls the sad sacrifice of those innocent children and confesses that his heart still breaks thinking about it all. The priest explains that the bizarre rumor actually works because eating the heart of a child really does amplify a mage's mana. He coldly adds that this terrible, macabre effect occurs even if the sacrificed child possesses no magical aptitude whatsoever. The villain cuts the meat on his plate and says this advantage is a privilege reserved for mages, claiming the jealousy of the weak distorted the truth. He points to the pile of crystal statues and preaches that Ernia's Grand Divine will inevitably demand a very high price. Escott walks calmly through the hall and asserts that the village of Ratville was merely the foundation stone to build the holy land of Gred Hill. He raises his hands, wrapped in golden flames, and says he is certain Ernia guided the Wind Mage there for a very special reason. The priest asks once more if Raneon does not wish to join him to fulfill the calling of creating a world where only mages exist. Far from there, the night grows dark and silent over the inn where all the previous commotion took place. Inside her dark bedroom, young Enoch remains sitting on the bed, holding tightly onto an old picture frame of her family. The photograph kept with so much affection shows a happy moment from the past, where her father held her tight with a broad smile on his face. Clutching the object tightly against her chest, the girl whispers for her father, an immense ache filling her young heart. She recalls a special moment when her father affectionately patted her head and handed her a mysterious wooden box. In the memory, he told her seriously to open that box only when she needed to protect someone truly precious. Remembering that important warning, the young girl makes a quick decision and stands up from the bed with determination in her eyes. She runs over to the wooden dresser in the corner of the room and opens the top drawer where she kept the precious box received from her father. She carefully opens the box and finds a necklace with a rough grey stone perfectly stored inside. The stone begins to emit a faint blue glow, and Enoch declares to herself that she cannot simply sit there waiting without doing anything. Meanwhile, the massive stone structure of the Order's main temple stands imposing against the cloudy sky. In the dungeon, young Raneon grits his teeth in deep hatred and asks if those innocent children had to perish just for such a futile reason. Overcome by overwhelming rage, he lets out a deafening shout and begins forcing all his mana to shatter the iron chains. His clenched fists begin to glow with an intense and powerful, purplish magical energy amidst the resistance of the metal. The containment seal on the chains begins to glow intensely in a bright pink hue as it attempts to suppress the prisoner's mana. Even under the suppression effect, the young mage releases violent gusts of wind through the hall that begin pushing the high priest back. Raneon's chest begins glowing brightly with a stunning green light, indicating that he is pushing his power far beyond all limits. A massive windstorm violently explodes from his body, causing the entire dungeon hall to tremble from the impact. Shielding himself from the furious gale, Escott asks with a look of surprise if that display of defiance is the mage's final answer. The religious leader focuses his glowing green eyes on the prisoner, closely analyzing the young man's incredible willpower. He explains that the mechanism suppresses the target's magic and materializes it into a sphere, causing excruciating pain the harder he tries to fight back. Raneon himself coughs up blood from the intense pain and collapses forward, while a sphere of pure glowing green energy floats right above him in the air. There, Escott calmly extends his arm and catches with his own hands the glowing sphere of concentrated mana that was just extracted from the boy. The priest marvels at the extreme density of the energy gathered there, and confesses he can barely measure the depth of his latent mana. Still panting and severely weakened by the extreme pain, Raneon himself slightly raises his head and watches the villain with suspicion and exhaustion. Without hesitating, the insane high priest opens his mouth wide and begins swallowing the glowing orb of wind elemental energy whole. He gulps down the powerful green mana orb with extreme ease, completing his terrible absorption process in the middle of the stone hall. With the wind energy integrated into his body, the priest begins emanating an eerie mystic glow before the imprisoned young mage. Suddenly, the villain's left eye begins glowing intensely in a vibrant green color, indicating that the stolen mana took full effect. A violent wind shockwave spreads through the dungeon walls, causing the massive crystal statues around them to vibrate. He praises the boy's fantastic energy and comments, with a mocking smile, that as a fellow mage, he even feels a bit envious of such power. The priest admits it is no easy task for a single ordinary person to raise a true army of mages, as it requires absurd amounts of mana. He observes the golden flames dancing in his hands and exclaims in ecstasy that the elemental power he just acquired is truly marvelous. Triumphantly, Escott declares there is no more time to waste, regretting that the young man did not join him voluntarily before being forced by divine will. Raneon himself glares at him enraged and thinks in despair that never in his life has he seen or heard of anyone capable of controlling someone else's mana in such a bizarre way. He realizes a complex technique like that could never be created by just one man. Recalling the villain's claim that other mages were acting elsewhere too, the young man wonders if Klein Heiss might be the grand mastermind behind it all, and regrets not having enough useful time left to think things through. As the high priest continues emanating that terrifying golden aura, young Raneon focuses entirely on his own survival. The young mage grits his teeth with all his remaining determination and focuses his thoughts on his first and most urgent goal, breaking free, in pure ecstasy, from feeling so much power flowing through his veins. Escott shouts to the heavens in sheer celebration. Violent waves of wind elemental energy continue spinning out of control throughout the dungeon hall, even with blood trickling from his eyes because of the extreme exertion. Young Raneon shouts furiously that he will find a way out of there, no matter what. The dungeon ceiling begins to crack, and small pieces of stone fall from the tremor caused by the massive amount of energy. Locked in one of the cells, Edward feels the ground shake and comments, startled, that it feels like an earthquake, suggesting they should get out of there. But analyzing the place calmly, the mercenary wonders why the Ernia Order itself would need a prison with such heavy structure. He appears chained with arms spread wide against a large symbol on the stone wall and wonders if they conduct torture sessions in there. Edward tries to call the attention of the hooded monk guarding the hallway, but the follower of the order remains in absolute silence. He thinks to himself that he managed to enter the temple easily, but now he needs to figure out a way to find the purification center. With a simple quick leg movement, the mercenary snaps the chains, holding him to the wall as if they were made of paper. He focuses his eyes on the stone floor and begins deducing that there must be a secret passage leading to the lower levels of the dungeon. Suddenly, a small, unexpected noise coming from the darkness of the hallway causes his eyes to widen in alert. To his complete surprise, young Enoch sneaks in, slowly opening one of the wooden secret doors of that restricted area. Edward stands jaw-dropped in utter amazement and wonders how that helpless little girl managed to reach that spot without being spotted by the guards. Enoch quickly places her index finger over her lips, making a shushing motion so the mercenary does not make a sound. Realizing there is no other choice but to accept the girl's help, Edward lets out a long, resigned sigh. With his eyes closed, he then begins shouting loudly and pretends to be feeling terribly ill, telling the guards he is about to throw up inside his cell. As the guard monks approach, confused to see what is wrong with the prisoner, Enoch takes advantage of the distraction to sneak past behind them. The mercenary continues letting out fake exaggerated groans of pain, making sure the guards stay completely focused on his performance. With great lightness and agility, Enoch reaches out her right hand to try and grab the ring of keys left on a wooden table. Her hand trembles slightly due to extreme nerves, but she pushes herself to maintain total focus and not make any metallic noise. With a quick, precise move, she finally manages to snatch the ring of iron keys without drawing the attention of the temple guards. The girl flashes a victorious smile and silently celebrates that her plan worked and she got what she needed. But suddenly, Edward's expression turns to sheer panic and he lets out a desperate shout, calling Enoch's name down the hallway. A hooded monk emerges from the shadows and grabs the girl from behind by surprise, causing the ring of keys to drop heavily onto the stone floor. Back in the deep dungeon, young Raneon continues screaming in agony and panting heavily due to the massive loss of his spiritual energy. Another large sphere of glowing green mana is extracted and floats in the air, emanating an absurd amount of wind elemental power. Escott comments that the young mage's persistence is pitiful and warns him that the total exhaustion of his mana will soon lead to his inevitable death. The villain brings his hand near the new floating sphere and praises the quality of that mana once again, labeling it as truly formidable. Without a shred of mercy, the high priest swallows the second sphere of green energy, while young Raneon watches it all completely exhausted on his knees. With this fresh dose of power, an even more massive explosion of golden flames engulfs the villain's body throughout the entire cavernous dungeon. Escott wears a fake expression of sadness and says that if the Wind Mage perishes there, it will mean the absolute end of all his immense potential. He advises the boy to think very carefully about the proposal, emphasizing that his potential is completely limitless as long as he stays alive. The high priest turns around and announces he will return to finish business as soon as the church's religious service concludes in the main temple. Silence now returns to the dark dungeon, filled only with the sound of Raneon's blood slowly dripping onto the floor, while he remains bound by chains and drained of strength. The young mage breathes with difficulty while trying to stay awake at all costs in the chair. He tries to force his wind magic one more time, yet realizes with despair that the result remains exactly the same as before. He notices that no matter what he does, the iron bracelet absorbs all his mana, and that the stronger the magic, the more it feeds the device. With his face covered in sweat and blood, he curses his situation in silence and frantically tries to find a way out of this terrible deadlock. He takes another deep breath and mentally prepares to focus all his remaining energy on one last attempt to use his wind magic. A flashback from his childhood shows young Simon talking happily with his brother Raiden about an important matter from their past. Raiden smiles affectionately and says their father would certainly be very happy if he knew Simon was capable of using spirit magic. However, the happy memory is abruptly cut short by the horrific image of a wooden cabin being completely consumed by violent flames. Simon watches in horror as his protector Rouget's bloodied, severed head is held by the hair directly in front of his eyes. Before the destructive fire, the imposing silhouette of Klein Heiss emerges, holding a bloody sword in one hand and the head in the other. Raiden and Simon watch the scene beside little Diana, weeping desperately, while the brothers ask why their father committed such a terrible atrocity. Klein Heiss responds coldly that it is merely the execution of a royal decree, and orders Simon to make himself useful for the first time in his life. Overcome by hatred and the pain of seeing her father dead, little Diana lunges forward with 2 knives in hand in a desperate attempt to attack the terrible executioner. Simon screams frantically for Diana to stop, but in a fraction of a second, the brave little girl is struck by a fatal slash from Klein Heiss mid-stride. Simon watches that horrific scene with wide, tear-filled eyes, completely paralyzed by the trauma of seeing his childhood friend killed right before him. Amidst the fire, Raiden steps protectively in front of Simon and desperately commands his brother to run away as fast as he can. Raiden charges at his own father to buy time for his younger brother, shouting with all his might, demanding that he run without looking back. A devastating sword blow slashes Raiden's back cruelly, spilling his blood into the air amidst that terrible fire. Simon watches horrified as the cold silhouette of his biological father, Klein Heiss, stands victorious over his brother's fallen, motionless body. The villain turns to Simon with a crazed glare and threateningly demands that his son surrender his own heart to him. Snapping abruptly back to the present, young Raneon opens his eyes in absolute panic and shock upon remembering that childhood trauma. He finds himself once again trapped in the dungeon's stone chair, while the new sphere of green mana floats silently above him. Gritting his teeth in rage, he thinks to himself that he cannot possibly let everything end there, and that he must find a way out. The young man focuses his tired gaze on the glowing, floating green mana sphere and begins devising a desperate plan in his mind. His blue eyes shine with renewed resolve as he meticulously analyzes the inner workings of the containment bracelet. He reflects silently for a few moments and concludes that there might be a single, risky chance to reverse the entire situation. Meanwhile, in the Order's prison cells, Edward's desperate shout for Enoch echoes ominously through the entire dark hallway. One of the guards holds Enoch up in the air with ease, while the little girl struggles frantically, shouting for him to let her go immediately. The monk complains irritably, unable to understand how that child managed to break into such a heavily guarded place, and grabs her arm even tighter. Edward fiercely shakes the iron bars in a rage and yells at the guards to let the girl go, asking if that is what Ernia's doctrine taught them. Enoch grits her teeth and remembers her father's advice once more about using the stone necklace only when she needed to protect someone important. Gathering her courage, the girl holds the grey stone necklace high up with her right arm and screams the mercenary Edward's name down the middle of the hallway. Both Edward and the hooded guards stop what they're doing and stare at her in complete silence, not understanding what she intends to do. Enoch shouts the mercenary's full name several times with the full strength of her lungs, but soon lowers her tone upon noticing that nothing happened. Suddenly she lets out a surprised whisper as she realizes that the necklace's mysterious stone is beginning to slowly detach from her hands in midair. The grey pendant detaches completely and falls toward the damp stone floor of the church dungeon under the girl's attentive gaze. The moment it hits the ground, the stone begins emitting an unbelievably intense magical blue light that instantly illuminates the entire place. A colossal explosion of mystical blue energy bursts violently, filling the entire area with an intense and completely blinding glare. Far from there, Escott preaches before his followers that the suffering they are enduring is merely a temporary and necessary stage of the process. The devotees afflicted by the trial remain on their knees on the floor, with hands joined in silent prayer, awaiting their leader's commands. The high priest wears a serene smile and preaches that the instant they all overcome fear, they will finally find divine balance. He raises his arms in ecstasy and assures that there in the purification center, all pain will cease and the people will finally become whole. One of the faithful clenches his hands tightly as the terrifying glowing blue crystals continue to spread relentlessly across his skin. Suddenly, the man lets out a gasp of shock upon realizing that the crystallization process has begun advancing at a frighteningly fast speed. Screams of despair and agony fill the hall as the devotees' bodies begin to be completely taken over by the sharp blue stones. Escott completely ignores the cries of pain and raises his arms, fervently calling upon the name of his deity, Ernia, amidst the chaos. The pain becomes unbearable for the faithful, who scream frantically for help as they realize they are turning entirely into crystal statues. Sharp crystals violently tear through the skin on their faces, while everyone lets out howls of agony from the accelerated, horrific transformation. The high priest merely watches the scene with open arms, an expression of sheer madness and satisfaction on his face before such cruelty. He displays a serene, cold look as he contemplates the completion of his horrific live artwork in the sacred temple's purification chamber. He mentally prays for Ernia to guide his steps toward his true and glorious divine calling to reorder the entire world. Meanwhile, deep in the dungeon, fragments of blue crystals keep falling from the ceiling due to constant, violent tremors. The metallic clatter of heavy iron chains echoes eerily along the damp walls of the cell where the boy is bound. Strong gusts of green wind keep swirling in a whirlwind around the Wind Mage in the stone chair. The Wind Mage focuses all his remaining strength, knowing the containment bracelet absorbs and gives physical form to his released spiritual mana. He plans to use that exact characteristic to his advantage to reverse the flow of his mana and cause a destructive overload inside the bracelet itself. The young man grits his teeth with resolve, aware that he will perish either way if he remains trapped there, leaving him no choice but to take the risk. He knows full well that he must calibrate it with pinpoint precision so that the truly massive overload occurs precisely inside the bracelet's core. Raneon desperately focuses all his concentration, knowing that if he fails for even a single second, his own body will implode from the sheer pressure of the mana. At the same time, in the upper chamber, the devotees' bodies finish crystallizing completely into terrifying statues of pure blue crystal. They freeze forever in expressions of pure agony and eternal despair, serving as raw material for the high priest's insane plans. The human statues pile up throughout the massive stone hall like a true army of lifeless soldiers, silently awaiting Ernia's command. Escott observes his terrifying, completed divine legion and declares in a dark tone of voice that he no longer has any reason to wait for anything. The high priest calmly extends his right hand, preparing to make his final decision even before hearing Raneon's direct response. He gently touches one of his devotees' crystallized statues to initiate the final stage of his horrific global plan. Escott decides it is time to get things started. At that exact moment, the person who was crystallized begins to move and lets out a terrifying shriek. The creature's eyes begin glowing intensely in a yellowish hue as the process advances across its entire face. Escott watches that frightening transformation with a very calm, satisfied smile on his face. The high priest tells the monster that it has been reborn as part of the divine army and must fulfill Ernia's divine will. Still, the creature lets out a furious roar and charges forward with full force, ready to spread chaos. Screams of horror begin echoing frighteningly through every corner of the massive temple. Iris is completely out of breath and tries to stay on her feet while breathing with great difficulty. She clutches her dress tightly upon realizing that the blue crystals on her leg are growing relentlessly. Iris looks around, completely lost, and wonders frantically where she should head at this point. Meanwhile, strong gusts of green wind begin cutting through the air with extreme violence in the darkness of the dungeon. Raneon fiercely focuses all his remaining mana and strength to try and break the power-draining device once and for all. The young man grits his teeth and lets out a groan of pure pain as he endures the immense pressure of his own spiritual mana. The runic symbol on the containment bracelet glows intensely with a vivid red light. The large sphere of concentrated energy begins spinning and wobbling uncontrollably due to the mage's interference. In pure agony, Raneon screams and ends up coughing up a lot of blood, unable to handle the terrible physical pain of his suffering body. Even severely injured, he realizes his plan is working and thinks to himself that he figured it would turn out like this. He knows that if the reverse flow is too strong, the immense internal strain will destroy his body for good. But if it is too weak, his mana will simply be absorbed, so he needs to apply the exact pressure on the device for it to work. Just then, the containment bracelet begins showing its first physical cracks under the massive accumulated pressure. Noticing the cracks, Raneon himself is filled with hope and mentally resolves that he just needs to endure a little more pain. The runic device cracks even further under the devastating effect of all that gathered destructive force. Raneon pushes himself desperately to the limit amidst the whirlwind of wind and shouts that he is just a little bit away from breaking free. Meanwhile, frantic screams for help begin echoing outside the temple beneath the dark night sky. One of the crystallized creatures steps violently onto the bloodied body of a helpless victim on the ground. The army of crystal monsters begins brutally attacking every citizen they encounter ahead in the town. Panic spreads fast, with people screaming for help and begging to save the children while fleeing the massacre. A cult follower prays, trembling in fear, pleading for those in need to overcome the trial and be reborn into the divine order. A giant monster emerges right behind him, while the poor man stammers frantically that the high priest will protect him. In the very next instant, the creature attacks without a shred of mercy, leaving only blood and destruction in its wake. The follower's bloodied hands remain fallen on the stone floor as proof of the horrific slaughter taking place there. Back inside the temple, the sound of heavy panting breaks the silence of the massive, dark corridor. Iris tries to walk falteringly through the hallway. Fighting through weakness and terrible pain in her leg, she suddenly hears a strange noise behind her and looks back in alarm toward the end of the long, dark corridor. One of the crystal monsters emerges from the shadows and begins pursuing her relentlessly while she runs, screaming. Trying to escape in a hurry, Iris ends up losing her balance because of her injured leg and falls straight onto the floor. The horrific creature approaches rapidly and prepares to deliver a fatal strike against the helpless woman. With no chance of escape, Iris cries in despair and whispers Enoch's name in her final moments of consciousness. A brutal attack strikes the spot dead on, causing the poor woman's blood to splatter across the corridor walls. From a distance, two people watch in silence the terrifying silhouette of the monster standing right beside Iris's fallen body. Enoch stands in complete shock and tries to call out for her mother with an extremely shaky and faint voice. Desperate, the girl runs toward the danger, screaming for her mother, while Edward tries to stop her, yelling for her to wait. Edward grows extremely tense and breaks into a cold sweat before that abomination. Wondering what kind of creature now stands there, he watches the crystal monster unleash a terrifying roar of pain and fury upon noticing their presence there in the church. Meanwhile, in the ruined dungeon, pieces of heavy chains fall to the floor, following a massive energy explosion. The stone seat itself, where the young mage was bound, ends up completely shattered by the force of the impact. Raneon simply collapses exhausted onto the stone floor, while a mysterious voice calls him a reckless fool for taking such huge risks again. The young man opens his eyes with difficulty and comes across a glowing figure right above his head. Elkan asks if he has finally woken up, and the young mage whispers his faithful companion's name upon seeing him there. Raneon anxiously asks if his friend is alright, but Elkan tells him not to worry about a spirit king and to focus on himself. Elkan says he had a bad feeling when their connection was severed, and looking at the young mage's condition now, he sees the enemy really got him. Raneon agrees somberly and confesses to his spirit companion that something happened in that place that he truly did not expect. The young man says they need to stop Escott and get out of there soon, but ends up groaning in pain, making Elkan notice he can barely stand on his own. Suddenly, the Spirit King looks up, deeply confused, as he senses a strange energy coming directly from the temple's surface. Elkan warns that something terrible has just begun up there, leaving the young mage completely stunned by the sudden revelation. The spirit explains that all the mana present on the surface is moving in an uncontrolled frenzy all at once. Raneon suddenly realizes that Escott's plans to destroy everyone in Great Hill have begun, and that terrible trial was also the High Priest's doing. At that moment, a massive surge of magical energy and light blue glow shines brightly in the dungeon, illuminating the entire ruined place. The young man and his spirit look startled toward the dungeon entrance upon realizing the approach of a dark figure. Escott emerges, walking calmly through the darkness of the temple, and declares in a solemn tone that this is a historic day for the entire world. The High Priest smiles cynically and says it is a great honor to meet the Spirit King in person on such a special day. Raneon desperately tries to stand up with great difficulty amidst the pain and shouts furiously at Escott. Elkan realizes with disgust that it was Escott who was manipulating all the mana on the surface, also commenting on the foul stench coming from him. The Wind Spirit warns that the situation is dire as he notices a massive army of crystal monsters approaching them. The horrific crystallized creatures roar furiously in the dungeon, ready to attack anyone in their path. Raneon is absolutely horrified to see that the townspeople who were crystallized suddenly started moving like mindless soldiers. The young mage shouts enraged, demanding to know what the High Priest did to all those innocent people from the village. With complete coldness and cynicism, Escott responds with open arms that he merely opened the eyes of those who possessed no magic. He explains that this is the process for inferior humans to accept magic and be reborn in new bodies, asking if it isn't beautiful. The villain makes one last offer for young Raneon to join him, saying that the boy's noble wind magic will make the Divine Legion perfect. Raneon angrily tells him to shut up and affirms with all the resolve in his soul that he will stop Escott's evil plans right then and there. Faced with the obvious refusal, Escott's friendly expression vanishes instantly, replaced by an extremely cold and serious glare. The High Priest simply moves his hand calmly and says that if that's how it is, he has no choice but to take action against them. A massive horde of crystal monsters advances relentlessly toward the two, unleashing terrifying roars throughout the dungeon. Raneon desperately tries to gather his wind magic for battle, but his weakened body protests in pain immediately from the intense physical strain. He anxiously wonders whether he can handle so many enemies at once while trapped in such a miserable state of exhaustion. Escott wears a mocking smirk as he contemplates the mage's visible despair and extreme weakness of the young wind mage before him. Suddenly, one of the crystal monsters strikes the ground, tearing a massive fissure into the dungeon's stone floor. Raneon remains completely baffled to see that the creature suddenly runs straight past him without even trying to attack him in any possible way. Escott laughs at the young man's confusion and explains he would never commit the huge folly of making a direct enemy out of the Spirit King himself. The army of crystal statues keeps running and climbing the temple stairs at high speed toward the exit. The High Priest darkly reveals that those who truly need to be eliminated first from his new world are merely the inferior, worthless beings who have not yet become complete and perfect in the eyes of his beloved deity Ernia. He stares directly at Raneon and asks what his final decision is, saying he can still change his mind while there is still time. Overcome by rage at such cruelty, Raneon furiously charges forward with everything and lands an extremely violent punch right in Escott's face. The young man grabs the injured villain by the collar, with intense hatred in his eyes, and calls him an unredeemable, crazy lunatic. Elkan interrupts him and warns that they have no time to waste on that madman, as they need to get out of there as fast as possible. The Wind Spirit warns frantically that if they don't hurry now, the entire neighboring village will be completely wiped out by the monsters. Meanwhile, in another part of the massive sacred temple, a thick cloud of dust begins to rise after a heavy impact occurs in the hallways. Edward walks worriedly through the rubble of the place and shouts frantically, asking where little Enoch ran off to. Enoch suddenly appears behind a defeated follower, saying she is right there, giving Edward quite a startle from the surprise. She proudly says she is pretty useful, and suggests Edward cut his mercenary fee in half for the help she provided along the way. The girl asks how he is fine while the other monks passed out, and he replies that it is pure willpower before criticizing her recklessness. The girl merely wears a confident smile on her face and calmly reveals that she had been to that dangerous place before. Edward is surprised by the revelation and concludes that this place must be a terrible base of operations for the Ernia Order. Enoch shares that when she was younger, she found her mother's work boring and used to follow her father to the religious order. She explains that she used to explore every corner of those buildings without issue, since back then there was no trial in the cult. The girl laughs, saying she used to sneak into restricted areas as a courage test, and Edward comments that she was always quite a brave rebel. She also reveals that her father was a great mage and made that special necklace for her, though his current whereabouts remain a complete mystery. Edward deduces that her father might be locked up in that temple too, and asks the girl to lead the way from that point on. Enoch mentally resolves, with determination, that she will save her father and mother with her own strength, unaware that Iris had already been attacked in the hallway. Seeing her mother lying on the floor, Enoch screams her name in despair, while Edward tries to contain her panic to keep her focused. Edward studies the grim scene with deadly seriousness and releases a deeply worried sigh as danger closes in. He watches in awe, wondering what kind of terrifying place this is as a crystal monster charges toward them at full speed. The crystallized creature unleashes a terrifying roar as it advances relentlessly toward the two intruders with frightening speed. With lightning-fast reflexes, Edward manages to shove little Enoch to the side to clear her from the path of that dangerous attack. Right after, the strong warrior steps up to the crystal creature and lands a powerful blow to check the opponent's violent momentum. Edward grits his teeth and lets out a groan of pure pain from the immense physical effort of colliding head-on with an opponent hard as stone. The crystal monster roars again in fury as its terrible strike is blocked by the mercenary's sheer physical strength alone. Gathering all his strength, Edward lets out a roar of determination and brutally slams the creature against the cold stone floor. The monster's impact against the ground is so violent that stone fragments and thick dust fly in every direction of the hallway. Despite the warrior's devastating strike, the crystal creature merely lets out a grunt of pain and begins slowly rising from the ground. Edward grins mockingly and asks if the monster didn't learn its lesson after crashing headfirst, calling it a stubborn and arrogant brute. The mercenary realizes he won't have even a second to catch his breath, while Enoch runs frantically toward her mother's motionless body. Enoch kneels beside Iris on the cold stone floor and tearfully begs her beloved mother to wake up and speak to her. Iris remains unconscious on the floor, breathing faintly and struggling because of her severe injuries. Enoch feels deeply relieved upon realizing her mother is still alive, but her relief immediately turns to terror at the severity of her condition, while Edward shouts her name. The warrior warns he will hold back the crystal monster and orders Enoch to flee the temple immediately with her injured mother to safety. Enoch realizes with fear that Edward's physical attacks aren't truly damaging the monster, and desperately wishes that Raneon were there. With tears in her eyes, the girl tries to support Iris's weakened body to carry her away from that horrific mortal combat. Suddenly, she calls out to the warrior in a hurry and warns that she has just come up with a crucial plan to save them from there. Enoch starts running down the hallway and shouts that she has a plan in mind, asking Edward to hold out against the enemy a little longer. The mercenary is baffled by the girl's sudden departure and calls back to her, demanding to know what she thinks she's doing. As Enoch keeps running, she decides that they urgently need magical help from a powerful mage. If they hope to defeat that abomination, she races through the dark temple corridors, desperately trying to remember the exact location nearby. Turning at one shadowy corner, Enoch finally spots a large iron door and celebrates finding the right place. She stops before the entrance to the cult's hidden alchemy and magic laboratory, with nervous, uneasy anticipation. The girl knows the place hides mysterious secrets, so she slowly pushes open the door, hoping some useful item or potion inside might help them in battle somehow. Peeking inside the dark room, Enoch gets a massive fright upon coming across a mysterious silhouette sitting motionless in a chair. She panics, realizing someone is in the laboratory and fearing a guard could spot her and have her captured at any moment now. Suddenly, as her eyes adjust to the mysterious figure, the girl's expression changes and her eyes widen in sheer terror as she freezes. She realizes that the figure in the chair is actually a monk's corpse, wrapped in strange dark vines of sinister energy nearby. Meanwhile, desperate screams of agony echo throughout Gred Hill beneath the red night sky. People flee through the dark streets, struggling desperately to escape the deadly clutches of the invading crystal soldiers. Several victims collapse badly wounded on the stone streets, with no chance to defend themselves against the ruthless fury of these crystalline creatures overrunning their home. From high up in the temple, Escott takes a deep breath, contemplating all that horrific destruction, and declares with a chuckle that it is a marvelous sight. The high priest fervently preaches that through all this suffering and death, the town will finally be reborn as a true Holy Land. Back in the dungeon, a massive whirlwind of green wind begins spinning wildly inside the chamber below at terrifying speed. However, the strong gust of wind blasts forward and hits the crystal monsters, instantly shattering the rigid bodies of several of them. More crystallized creatures are thrown violently away by the immense pressure generated by the young man's wind magic. Raneon stands firmly amid all that destruction, glaring at the remaining hordes with a fierce, unwavering focus in his bright eyes. Exhausted, the young mage wonders whether it is already too late, as Elkan warns that energy will destroy his body. However, Raneon firmly disagrees and declares with fierce determination that there is still one last resort left to win this battle. Elkan grows intrigued and asks what could possibly be done in such a dangerous, complicated situation as this to change anything. The Spirit King focuses his piercing gaze on the boy and begins suspecting the real danger of what his contractor is planning. Deeply concerned by the dangerous plan, the Wind Spirit asks in alarm whether Raneon truly intends to go through with it anyway. Raneon ignores his friend's concerns and calls Elkan's name, asking the spirit to lend him all of his incredible power right now. Back in the laboratory, Enoch keeps staring at the lifeless body in the chair, taking note of the strange dark chains around it. The girl panics as she confirms it is an actual corpse and lets out a terrifying scream of pure horror. She tries to control her fear and mentally reminds herself that she needs to hurry and find a useful item quickly to help Edward in the battle. Enoch studies the laboratory carefully and starts noticing something strangely familiar about the lifeless body nearby. She lets out a gasp of shock as she recognizes the details of the clothes and the face of the man in the chair. The girl slowly turns around with an expression of pure shock and disbelief in her eyes. With tears streaming down her face, she realizes that the corpse in front of her is actually her very own missing father. The girl staggers backward in horror and whispers, unable to believe her father is dead right there. She tries to back away frantically while sobbing, wondering why her father is in such a deplorable state. In the middle of her despair, Enoch ends up tripping over a chain on the floor and falls backward hard. Lying on the cold laboratory floor, the girl begins trembling uncontrollably as she grieves the terrible loss. She breathes with great difficulty, while tears roll down her face in the presence of that painful truth. Suddenly, she shifts her terrified gaze to something lying right beside the wooden crates on the floor. The girl spots a beautifully decorated wooden box and realizes that mysterious object holds something very important. Meanwhile, in the hallway, Edward launches into an attack with all his speed and agility against the crystal monster. The mercenary lands an extraordinarily devastating blow against the creature's chest, shattering pieces of its armor. He takes advantage of the enemy's moment of recoil to pick up a heavy stone from the rubble on the floor with his right hand. The experienced warrior uses all his physical strength to hurl the projectile with extreme accuracy at the opponent. The rock strikes the crystal monster's head dead center, shattering upon the massive impact. Giving no time to react, Edward leaps high into the air and positions himself to deliver a final downward strike. The mercenary lands a devastating flying dropkick to the creature's head, crushing it against the stone floor with brute force. Edward lands in a crouch amid the dust, carefully watching his fallen opponent lying motionless on the ground. He wipes sweat from his face and curses while begging that cursed, stubborn monster to finally stay down once and for all. He thinks to himself that if he had a decent weapon, he would have won already, while noticing the creature rise yet again. At that moment, Enoch comes running back frantically down the hallway and screams for Edward to close his eyes immediately. The girl throws her father's small magical amulet straight at the terrible crystal monster's head. Edward's eyes widen in complete shock and confusion, unable to understand the girl's sudden move. He screams in despair, calling her a fool and reminding her that Iris is still lying right in the middle of that dangerous hallway. In the next split second, the small stone pendant begins emanating an unbelievably intense blinding glow. A colossal burst of pure dispersal magic explodes, illuminating the entire massive hallway in brilliant colors. The mercenary quickly shields his eyes with his arms against the blinding glare from the massive magical blast. He cautiously opens one eye through the dense, swirling smoke, trying to understand what just happened amid the dust surrounding him. Utterly confused, the warrior wonders whether the pendant wasn't truly explosive. Noting no destructive damage around him, Edward focuses his vision through the thick smoke ahead with concern and suddenly notices the creature's silhouette changing. The crystal armor that covered the monster's entire body begins crumbling away, breaking apart into dust across the floor. The mercenary watches the armor crumble across the temple floor in complete shock and asks aloud what is truly happening in this terrifying place. Enoch tearfully explains that her father understood the whole trial, including exactly why people's bodies became crystal. Clutching the wooden medicine box, she cries and explains that her father prepared a temporary countermeasure that could interrupt the ongoing crystallization process. Enoch begins reading the note her father left within the box, addressed to whoever discovered it. His letter reveals the truth, that the divine trial responsible for the town's suffering had been created by his own hands. His note explains that granting divine magic to non-mages was the perfect method the Ernia Order found to spread its corrupt ideology, but the scientists soon realized with horror that Escott's advancing research had become something completely different from what Enoch's father originally intended the divine trial to achieve in practice. Because stopping the research safely proved impossible, her father created the temporary dispersal artifact as his only remaining way to correct that terrible mistake. The note explained that the magical pendant could temporarily interrupt the crystallization process and disperse the armor forming around a person's body during transformation. Relieved that Iris seems calmer, Edward ironically notes that the crystallization itself kept her injuries from becoming fatal in this particular case. Enoch wipes the tears from her tired face under the watchful, concerned gaze of her faithful mercenary companion. Edward places his hand affectionately on the girl's head and tells her to hide with her mother while he takes care of the rest. However, to the warrior's surprise, Enoch firmly refuses the request and shows a glare filled with pure determination to fight. Enoch says her beloved father wanted to save innocent people, and she intends to finish the honorable work he began. Edward smiles proudly at her courage and quietly accepts the determined girl's brave decision with a look of respect to help in the battle. He privately recognizes the unmistakable look of someone far too stubborn who would never listen to reason at a dangerous time like this anyway. The girl bids a temporary, affectionate farewell to Iris, promising in her thoughts to return safe and sound to her mother's side. She whispers that she will return soon, reflecting that were it not for the love of her cherished family, she too might have surrendered herself completely to Escott's evil will. Enoch's father's note ended with a desperate plea that whoever found it protect his family and stop Escott's horrifying plans. Meanwhile, in the dungeon, the storm of green wind keeps strengthening as it spins with mounting fury. The massive wind spirit manifests in the physical world and is surprised to see that its summoner is merely a young mage. The great wind spirit questions how a boy so young was capable of summoning such massive mystic strength. The Spirit King Elkan deduces that Raneon burned his own life force to open the spirit gate and bring him forth. The immense pressure of the destructive wind tears stones free and shatters everything throughout the deep dungeon. Elkan warns that the price of a pact with the Spirit King is far too heavy and asks him directly if Raneon can truly bear such a burden. Raneon shouts through the windstorm, gathering every remaining drop of his determination to prove his strength to Elkan in battle. He stands firm at the center of the luminous whirlwind, refusing to retreat even a single step. The Spirit King notes that although the mage seems to have lost everything in life, the determined light in his blue eyes is not faded. Back on the temple surface, Escott feels an unusual, powerful gale begin sweeping across his face on the balcony high above. The high priest stares in shock, wondering what Raneon is doing below. A colossal pillar of green wind tears through the temple roof, leaving him completely bewildered by the impossible spectacle around him, as he wonders how the mage still has so much energy. The towering tornado continues rising toward the heavens, scattering immense destructive energy across the entire surrounding region far below. Escott curses, insisting the man shouldn't have a single drop of mana left, and demanding to know how he produces such a gale. For the first time, the high priest's calm, cynical expression gives way to fear and open tension. He looks below and sees Raneon standing at the center of the ruined crater, surrounded by violently swirling gusts of green wind ripping through the air. The wind mage advances slowly, with firm steps amidst the destructive whirlwind, displaying no weakness whatsoever. From high on the balcony, the villain screams that he doesn't know what kind of trick the young man used to conceal such a colossal amount of mana. He then points directly at Raneon, and immediately commands his entire army of crystal statues to advance and capture him. Raneon releases a weary sigh, and gathers all his remaining energy as he sees dozens of monsters rushing toward him from the ruins. His blue eyes glow intensely as he prepares to release the devastating attack he had saved. With extreme force, the powerful wind slices through the air and shatters the crystal monsters trying to approach him. A true protective dome of wind forms around Raneon, relentlessly destroying every single one of the cult's crystal creatures as they approach. From high on his balcony, the high priest watches that massive display of power, completely terrified and trembling. The young mage extends his right arm with all his strength, directing the massive windstorm straight at the villain. The violent attack slams into the temple balcony with overwhelming force and shatters the entire stone structure apart. Stone fragments and crystal splinters burst outward in all directions beneath the overwhelming force generated by the raging windstorm above. Escott is hurled backward and cries out in pain as the balcony is completely destroyed by the blast. He stares at the devastation and horror, unable to comprehend such destructive power. The villain wonders how Raneon ever allowed himself to be captured by that mana-draining device. He trembles in horror upon realizing the magical energy radiating from Raneon resembles that of a spirit king. His eyes widen as he deduces the legendary pact the mage made, refusing to believe that such a thing could possibly be real. In the heat of battle, an old memory resurfaces in the Wind Mage's mind, bringing past feelings to the surface. He recalls the stern voice, asking if he had truly borrowed the legendary power of the Spirit King. The young man remembers desperately begging Elkan to lend his grand strength during a difficult moment. The Wind Spirit had questioned whether he should really grant such power to a mere human. He explained that the boy intended to use his own human body as a vessel to manifest his true spiritual form in that world. The young man agreed, explaining that since he didn't have enough mana for the summoning in his current state, he would need another way. The spirit warned him gravely that an ordinary human body could never withstand such energy, and that it would surely kill him. He asked in concern how far the boy intended to walk toward his own death for that cause. But Raneon merely begged for Elkan's help, stating that his life was all he had left in this world to offer in exchange. The spirit and the young mage remained silent in the massive damp hall, staring at each other for a long moment. A solitary tear rolled down the boy's determined face, showing all the pain and resolve of his wounded soul. The Spirit King sighs deeply and remarks that humans can be foolishly sentimental creatures. Back in the present, the mage focuses all the pack's energy around himself, preparing to deliver his strongest strike against the terrifying foe. His vision starts failing, and he realizes that he has at most 1 minute before the pact makes his body collapse completely under the unbearable strain it creates. Even aware of the short time his body can withstand it, he decides that it is still more than enough to finish the battle anyway. He raises his right hand and concentrates the entire raging windstorm into a destructive sphere. The young mage advances with unwavering determination and swears in his thoughts that he surely will end this entire battle with a single blow. Raneon roars with all his fury that Escot's evil plan will be stopped then and there for good this time. Escot laughs sarcastically and tells Raneon that they are merely walking the correct path towards salvation. Meanwhile, people run frantically through the village, desperately trying to escape the terrible and merciless divine army created by the High Priest. One innocent citizen shrieks in agony as a soldier strikes him, impaling his body with a sharp spike of blue crystal in the street. The massacre continues relentlessly, revealing that this monstrous crystal army can be recreated as many times as Escot desires. Raneon shouts furiously, ordering the scoundrel to stop all that cruelty, and launches a massive blade of wind. At the last second, Escot manages to summon a golden hexagonal magic barrier to completely protect himself from the attack. The High Priest acknowledges the Spirit King's strength, but mocks Raneon, saying his borrowed power is temporary. He wears a cynical smile and asks threateningly which of the two the boy thinks will collapse and perish first in the fight. Raneon grits his teeth with hatred blazing in his eyes and screams the High Priest's name aloud, preparing his next attack. A thundering explosion occurs in the temple, shattering stones and sending smoke rising throughout the combat area. The crystal monsters keep emerging and moving through the rubble in terrifying waves. He realizes in despair that the creatures keep coming no matter how many he defeats, while his strength fades rapidly. His time is almost up when an even more gigantic monster rises before him from the darkness, making Raneon realize how rapidly the entire situation is deteriorating. Escot watches everything from high on his balcony and laughs triumphantly while holding the glowing artifact that was with Enoch. Suddenly, the High Priest stops laughing upon noticing a strange glow and an unexpected presence emerge at the scene. A massive explosion of colorful magical light suddenly erupts right in the middle of the ruined battlefield. Raneon looks around in total shock, utterly confused as he sees all the nearby crystal monsters instantly stop attacking him. In the very next moment, the massive statues begin breaking apart and falling onto the stone floor, leaving Escot completely stunned. The villain panics and demands to know why his precious divine creatures stopped moving. A friendly voice calls from the top of the rubble, praising all the massive destruction caused by the young Wind Mage. Raneon's weary eyes widen as he turns toward the voice and instantly recognizes that person's familiar presence. Edward and Enoch appear standing on one of the temple's destroyed stone walls, waving to their injured companion in the crater. Raneon asks in surprise whether Edward was the one responsible, remembering with irony that the mercenary swore he would never willingly work with him. Escot screams furiously at Edward, calling him a pathetic worm with no mana and demanding to know what cowardly trick was used. The mercenary merely smiles mockingly and replies that the villain talks too much, suggesting he shouldn't be looking at him right now. Edward provocatively warns the High Priest to pay careful attention to what is right behind him. In that instant, Raneon suddenly reappears directly behind the terrified, completely cornered villain, while gathering massive green wind around his fingertips. Escott senses the approaching mortal danger and grits his teeth in despair, realizing he has no possible way left to escape from the incoming attack. The young mage releases a powerful, devastating blast of wind all at once against the enemy, who screams his name in terror. The high priest screams frantically amidst the wind, questioning why Raneon himself, being a mage, is allying himself with ordinary humans. He yells in fury that mages suffered centuries of persecution, and asks if the boy wants to condemn them to live through that nightmare again. Raneon calmly maintains his usual cold, steady gaze, completely ignoring the high priest's empty, twisted words. The hurricane swallows the villain whole, as a destructive wave razes the entire remaining structure of the temple. On impact, Escott's entire magic barrier is shattered, and he realizes in despair that his powers have vanished. Raneon fiercely unleashes one final desperate battle cry, putting every single drop of his remaining strength into pushing the wind to its absolute limit. A massive flash of light consumes the entire battlefield, ending the terrible showdown once and for all in spectacular fashion. Gradually, the massive windstorm begins to dissipate, leaving only silence and smoke hovering in the air. The high priest collapses from above and lets out a grunt of pure pain and defeat as he is slammed brutally against the stones. The badly injured priest falls heavily into the center of the massive crater formed across the ruined ground of the temple site. He lies motionless and weak amidst the rubble, his clerical robe completely torn and filthy with blood and dust. Raneon calmly approaches the fallen villain and firmly tells him that what he was actually doing was not a crusade of liberation. The boy coldly concludes that all of Escott's madness was merely a cruel slaughter of innocent people who could not defend themselves. After delivering his final words, the young mage begins losing his balance dangerously due to his body's extreme exhaustion. Edward and Enoch watch from above with great concern, sensing that something very severe is about to happen to their friend. Lacking the strength to stay standing, Raneon himself ends up collapsing face first onto the cold stone floor of the temple, completely unconscious. Desperate, his companions scream the Wind Mage's name upon seeing his motionless body on the blood-stained ground. The scene abruptly cuts to absolute silence in the middle of a dense, damp forest under the moonlight. Suddenly, one of the crystal monsters emerges in the dark woods and steps violently onto the corpse of a hunted wild animal. The creature lets out a monstrous, terrifying roar that echoes chillingly through all the surrounding trees of the forest. Two mysterious figures wearing dark cloaks walk through the woods, unaware that they are being closely watched by the monster. Suddenly, one of the dark-cloaked figures calmly steps up before the crystal creature, ready to engage it. With a single swift motion, a powerful spell is fired, slicing through the air and striking the monster dead on. The crystallized creature's body is split completely in half by the immense force of that mysterious magical strike. One of them observes the crystal fragments and comments that it seems to be one of the creations Escott was researching, but the other says he doesn't care. The mysterious mage asks in a low voice what his companion truly plans to do with the defeated high priest. He replies coldly that first they will evaluate if Escott's life still has any utility, stating he has no right to perish without permission. Suddenly, deep within Raneon's mind, the darkness of the past returns, and a familiar voice whispers the name of the dreadful Klein. The voice screams, ordering the Heart Hunter to stop immediately right where he is, reliving the terrible memories of the past. Klein merely wears a mocking, cruel smirk, saying it is pathetic to see someone so obsessed and consumed by the desire for revenge. He arrogantly questions what would give the young man the right to speak of taking revenge on him after everything that happened. The Wind Mage breaks into a cold sweat in his painful nightmare, reliving all the agony and trauma of that past encounter. The shadows of the crystallized people surround him in the dream, whispering that he knew they were human and calling him a murderer, just like Klein. The crystal hands pull the young man into the darkness of the abyss, while terrifying voices keep repeating endlessly that he is a murderer. Raneon suddenly wakes up startled and panting in a hospital bed, shouting frantically from the horrific nightmares haunting him. Enoch and Edward, who were near the bed, look surprised at the boy upon realizing he has finally regained consciousness. Relieved, the emotional girl rushes forward and gives Raneon a tight hug, happily celebrating that he finally woke up. She says, crying with happiness, that she was very worried and hadn't even had the chance to properly thank him for everything. Edward playfully asks the girl to step back a bit from the boy, reminding her that he is still injured and might end up suffocated. The girl remembers that Raneon must be absolutely starving after so long without eating, and runs off excitedly to prepare a nice hot soup for him. Edward approaches the bed in a friendly manner and comments that the Wind Mage was out cold for an entire week. At the inn, Enoch works hard to help out, while Iris, still in recovery, watches everything with a tender look from behind the counter. In his recovery room, Raneon quietly studies his bandaged hand and feels relieved to think that he actually managed to survive that trial. However, he grows concerned upon realizing that Elken is not responding to his mental calls, questioning what might have happened to the spirit. The young mage hurriedly asks Edward about Escot's whereabouts, displaying fear that the villain might have escaped. Edward crosses his arms with a confident smile and reassures his friend, saying they locked Escot in the deepest subterranean cell of the temple. The warrior explains that many wanted Escot's immediate execution, but they decided to keep him alive temporarily while seeking a possible cure for the trial. Raneon quietly listens to Edward's explanation in silence, with a very serious and thoughtful expression on his face. The young man stands up all at once, affirming he needs to see Escot immediately, ignoring the mercenary's protests about his health condition. The Wind Mage insists there are still important answers he needs to wring from the High Priest in the destroyed temple's prison. Shortly after, the three walk slowly in the daylight through the devastated, rubble-filled streets of Gred Hill. Raneon carefully observes the bleak scenery around them with sadness and comments that the town's destruction was far worse than he had imagined. Edward smiles warmly and tells him not to worry, stating that material destruction is 1,000 times better than the perishing of all residents. The young man silently blames himself for the town's ruin, but Enoch interrupts him firmly, telling Edward to shut his mouth for once. Raneon quietly looks to the side, surprised by little Enoch's protective and affectionate attitude in the face of his guilt. Suddenly, the villagers whisper about the Wind Mage from a distance, recognizing him as the foreign mage who used strange magic there. One of the citizens approaches quickly with an outstretched hand and calls out to the young Wind Mage directly in the street. At that exact moment, a swift and terrifying flash of his nightmare of being called a murderer resurfaces in the boy's tormented mind. He breaks into a cold sweat and closes his eyes, mentally preparing to receive the blame and rejection from the frightened crowd. However, to his utter amazement, the man grasps his hand tightly and thanks him with genuine emotion for saving their lives. The entire crowd thanks him from the heart for stopping Escot's cruelty and protecting the survivors of the terrible trial in Gred Hill. The boy averts his guilty gaze and confesses sorrowfully that he doesn't deserve gratitude as he failed to save the dozens of crystallized people. An elderly man from the village leans on his cane and says wisely that they are not fools to believe those people would return to normal as if by magic. The elder concludes that the young man freed the victims from eternal suffering and saved the rest of the residents, asking him to accept everyone's sincere thank you. Raneon quietly gazes at the crowd of residents, moved with a gentle glint of emotion and relief in his deep blue eyes. With humility and respect, the mage thanks them sincerely in return for the people's warm words of affection. Edward and little Enoch watch that beautiful scene with genuine smiles, feeling very proud of their friend. Edward walks excitedly alongside them toward the temple and celebrates, saying he was sure everything would turn out fine in the end. Enoch softly whispers to Raneon, poking fun at Edward's lack of awareness, and the young mage merely smiles softly at the girl's comment. Suddenly, the experienced mercenary stops walking in the middle of the hallway and looks back, confused, as he hears a strange noise. Raneon's eyes suddenly widen, and he freezes completely as he senses a strong, mysterious presence rapidly approaching them. Enoch notices the sudden shift in Raneon's behavior and anxiously calls out to him as his whole body tenses. Edward puts his arm in front of Enoch to protect her and tells the girl firmly not to take another step forward. The Wind Mage focuses all his attention on the darkness ahead, leaving his friends intrigued by his serious reaction. Edward says he has a terrible feeling that this horrific situation at the temple still hasn't truly come to an end yet. He notices fresh bodies on the floor and concludes that someone passed through there recently, following the tracks down into the basement. Without a second thought, Raneon immediately dashes at top speed down the stairs, while Edward shouts in vain for him to wait a moment. The mage runs, knowing that if the intruder's target is Escot in the underground cell, there is a strong chance the intruder is connected to Klein. He thinks with intense hatred in his heart that the mysterious intruder might be the villain Klein himself coming in person to act. Suddenly, a sharp bloody blade slices through the air in the dark and grazes right past young Raneon's startled face. Edward appears rapidly at the last second and uses his own body to help the young mage dodge the fatal blow on the stairs. Both of their eyes widen in complete shock as they finally manage to spot the silhouette of the assailant hidden in the shadows. The mysterious intruder notices their presence and comments, surprised that there are still survivors amidst all those temple ruins. The man observes the boy on the stairs and calls him by his old name of Simon, leaving the young mage completely paralyzed in shock. Raneon silently stares at the figure before him with an expression of pure disbelief and horror upon hearing that familiar voice he hated so much. The young man grits his teeth with intense hatred and whispers with extreme difficulty as he faces the cruel enemy before him. He comes face to face with a sinister, mocking smirk of Raneon, the red-haired man carrying bloody daggers in his hands. Edward grows extremely tense in the hostile atmosphere and asks Raneon if he could possibly know the mysterious assassin. In a cold voice heavy with resentment, Raneon responds with his back turned to his friend, saying that he knows the man very well from his past. The young man reveals that the man's name is Raneon and painfully explains that the mysterious figure is actually his own older brother. Raneon taunts him, calling Raneon his little brother, and mocks his white ponytail, cynically asking if he really survived. The villain chuckles, saying so many people died to protect young Raneon in the past, so he should really try his best to stay alive.